When my wife and her millionaire boss took my house, my 5-year-old son, and $90,000 of my life savings, every person in that courtroom expected me to break. They expected me to get on my knees and beg for mercy. They wanted me to be the pathetic, defeated man they painted me to be. Instead, I stood tall, looked the judge dead in the eye, handed over one single signed document, and said, "Your Honor, I highly suggest you read page 2. That courtroom victory was the end of a nightmare. But to understand how I completely dismantled their lives, you have to understand how they destroyed mine." It all started exactly 72 hours earlier on a cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in the fluorescent glare of a local pharmacy, shivering slightly in my damp work jacket. My 5-year-old son Leo had been struggling with his asthma all week. The sudden drop in temperature always hit his small lungs hard. That morning I had listened to him wheeze at the breakfast table, his little chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. It broke my heart. I am a supply chain manager for a mid-sized logistics firm. My job is literally to ensure things get where they need to be on time. But sitting there watching my boy struggle, I felt completely helpless. I had clocked out of my shift 2 hours early, sacrificing my hourly pay just to rush to the clinic, get a new prescription, and get to the pharmacy counter. The pharmacist, a tired-looking woman with thick glasses, handed me the small white paper bag. She smiled sympathetically and told me the total was $68.50. I reached into my wallet, pulled out my debit card, and slid it into the chip reader. I did not even look at the screen. I was already mentally calculating how fast I could drive home through the afternoon traffic to get this inhaler into Leo's hands. The machine let out a sharp, angry beep. The pharmacist looked at her monitor, frowned, and looked back at me. She said my card had been declined. I smiled politely, assuming it was a simple chip error. I wiped the card on my jacket and inserted it again. My heart rate stayed perfectly calm. I knew exactly what was in that account. My wife Claire and I shared a joint life savings account. We had been building it dollar by dollar for 7 years. I had worked countless double shifts, skipped lunches, and taken on grueling weekend warehouse audits just to build a safety net for our family. That account was supposed to be the down payment for a new house with a big backyard for Leo. It was supposed to be his future college fund. I checked the balance every single Friday. It was exactly $90,450. The machine beeped again, louder this time. Declined. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up my neck. The people standing in line behind me shifted impatiently. I muttered an apology, stepped out of the checkout line, and walked over to the pharmacy waiting chairs. I pulled out my phone to open my banking app. I figured the bank had flagged the transaction for fraud. It happens all the time. I typed in my password, my thumb slightly numb from the cold rain outside. The screen loaded. I stared at the numbers. My brain simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Available balance, $0.00. I refreshed the app. I closed it and opened it again. $0. I clicked on the transaction history. My breath caught in my throat. Just 3 hours earlier, there was a massive outgoing wire transfer. The entire balance of $90,450 had been moved to an external, unrecognized account. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized my chest. My first thought was not betrayal. It was theft. I thought some international hacker had breached our accounts. I thought our entire family identity had been stolen. I frantically dialed Claire's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I dialed her office direct line. A receptionist put me on hold and then the line disconnected. I was shaking. I walked back to the pharmacy counter, pulled a crumpled $50 bill and a $20 bill from my emergency cash in my wallet, and slammed them on the counter. I grabbed the white paper bag holding my son's inhaler and ran out into the pouring rain. I threw my truck into gear and sped toward the downtown commercial district. Claire is the corporate operations director for a massive cutthroat real estate development firm. Her world is made of glass skyscrapers, marble floors, and executive boardrooms. My world is made of loading docks, freight schedules, and steel toes. We had always been different, but I thought we were building a life together. I thought my grounding presence was the anchor to her soaring ambition. I broke 3 speed limits getting to her building. I illegally parked my truck in a loading zone, not caring if it got towed. I ran through the revolving glass doors, completely ignoring the security desk. I knew the layout of the building because I had helped her move into her corner suite 2 years ago. I rode the elevator to the 50th floor, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. I kept rehearsing what I would say. I was going to tell her to freeze her credit. I was going to tell her we needed to call the police and the federal fraud department immediately. The elevator doors slid open. The executive floor was quiet, lined with thick carpets and expensive modern art. I sprinted down the hallway toward her office. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open, the words of panic already forming on my tongue. But the words died in my throat. Claire was not frantically on the phone with the bank. She was not crying over our stolen future. She was sitting casually on the edge of her massive mahogany desk. Standing directly between her legs, leaning in impossibly close, was her boss, Rick Caldwell. Rick was the regional vice president of the firm. He was 50 years old, wore a bespoke Italian suit, and sported a silver watch that probably cost more than my entire annual salary. He held a crystal glass of champagne in one hand. Claire was holding a matching glass in her other hand. She was throwing her head back, laughing at something he had just whispered. Her free hand was resting flat and intimately against Rick's chest. I stood frozen in the doorway. The white paper bag holding my son's asthma medication slipped from my fingers and hit the carpet with a soft thud. Claire did not jump. She did not scream. She did not scramble away from Rick. She simply turned her head, looked at me, and let her hand slowly slide off his chest. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by a look of absolute chilling indifference. Her eyes were completely dead. I could not breathe. My brain was violently trying to smash 2 impossible realities together. The stolen $90,000 and the scene unfolding right in front of me. I looked at her and asked what she was doing. My voice cracked. I asked her where our money went. I asked her why the account was empty. Rick Caldwell took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne. He did not look embarrassed. He looked annoyed. He looked at me the way a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered onto his pristine, manicured lawn. He set his glass down on the desk, reached over, and pressed a button on the office intercom. He calmly told security to send 2 guards to the executive suite immediately. I stepped toward Claire, my hands trembling. I begged her to talk to me. I asked her if she took the money. I asked her if this was some kind of sick joke. Claire finally moved. She walked over to her desk, completely ignoring my pleading questions. She opened her top drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She walked right up to me, her expensive perfume hitting my senses, reminding me of the woman I thought I knew. She did not apologize. She did not show a single ounce of guilt. She shoved the envelope into my chest. She told me our marriage was over. She told me to open the envelope and read it very carefully. My hands shook so violently I could barely tear the paper flap open. I pulled out a stack of legal documents. The heavy black font at the top of the page made my blood turn to ice. Emergency ex parte restraining order. I started reading the paragraphs, my vision blurring. The legal jargon was a weapon designed to destroy me. Claire had gone to a judge early that morning and signed a sworn affidavit. She claimed I was demonstrating erratic and financially abusive behavior. She claimed I was mentally unstable. She explicitly wrote that she feared for her safety and the safety of our 5-year-old son, Leo. It was a complete, calculated, malicious lie. I had never raised my voice at her. I had never touched her in anger. I had spent my entire adult life providing for them, protecting them, and loving them unconditionally. I looked up at her, tears of pure betrayal stinging my eyes. I asked her how she could do this. I told her it was a lie. Claire crossed her arms. Her voice was as cold as winter steel. She told me I was legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of our suburban home. She told me I was banned from going to Leo's elementary school. She looked me dead in the eye and told me the $90,000 was gone. It was legally secured, and I would never see a single penny of it again. Rick stepped up behind her, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder. He looked at me and smirked. He told me I was a loser who could not provide the life Claire deserved. He told me the game was over, I had lost, and I needed to crawl back to whatever warehouse I came from. Before I could even formulate a sentence to defend myself, heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. 2 massive corporate security guards burst into the office. Rick pointed at me and told them I was trespassing and violating a court order. The guards did not ask questions. They grabbed me by my arms, their grips bruising my skin. I fought them, screaming Claire's name, demanding to know where my son was, demanding to know how she could steal the money I saved for his future. She simply turned her back to me, picked up her champagne glass, and clinked it against Rick's glass. I was dragged backward out of the office. I was shoved into the elevator, my protests bouncing off the polished steel walls. The guards dragged me through the opulent marble lobby in front of dozens of staring employees. They threw me out the front doors. I stumbled onto the wet concrete, falling hard onto my hands and knees. The cold rain soaked through my clothes instantly. I kneeled there on the sidewalk, the busy city traffic roaring past me. I looked down at my hands. In my left hand, I was clutching a court document that legally stripped me of my home and my child based on a monstrous lie. In my right hand, I was holding the white paper bag with the asthma inhaler that my son desperately needed. I had walked into that pharmacy as a proud father and a loving husband. 72 hours later, I was homeless, entirely penniless, utterly humiliated, and forcibly separated from the only thing in the world that mattered to me. I had been completely ambushed and destroyed by the legal and corporate systems that Rick and Claire manipulated with terrifying ease. But as I knelt there in the freezing rain, the crushing despair slowly began to harden into something else. It hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. They thought I was just a warehouse box pusher who would roll over and accept defeat. They thought they had backed a helpless animal into a corner. They had no idea that they had just forced me to become the architect of their absolute destruction. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement of my own driveway is an image permanently burned into my brain. 2 county patrol cars sat idling on the curb in the freezing rain. The officers were polite, but absolutely unyielding. They stood on my front porch with their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. They held a formal document signed by a family court judge, and in the eyes of the law, that single piece of paper transformed me from a dedicated father into a dangerous threat. I was given exactly 10 minutes to enter my own house and pack a single duffel bag. I walked slowly through the hallway of the home I had spent 5 years paying a heavy mortgage on. I walked past the kitchen wall where I had measured my son Leo's height in faint pencil marks every single birthday. I could not even go into his bedroom to kiss him goodbye because Claire had already taken him to an undisclosed location earlier that afternoon. I walked out the front door carrying nothing but a gym bag full of work clothes, while my neighbors peeked through their living room blinds, whispering and pointing. I climbed into my 8-year-old Ford Explorer and turned the key. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, but the heater took 20 agonizing minutes to warm up. I drove to a massive retail parking lot on the desolate edge of town and parked under a flickering halogen light. That night was the longest, most hollow night of my entire existence. The temperature dropped dangerously close to freezing as the rain turned into a bitter sleet. I wore 2 layers of work flannel and covered my legs with a heavy moving blanket I kept in the trunk. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire sipping expensive champagne and Rick Caldwell smirking at me from behind his massive mahogany desk. I saw the zero balance on my banking application representing $90,000 of stolen life savings. I heard the deadbolt click on my own front door, locking me out of the life I built. But the worst pain was the physical, overwhelming absence of my 5-year-old son. I kept reaching out in the dark, my exhausted mind playing cruel tricks on me, making me think Leo was asleep in the passenger seat, clutching his asthma inhaler. When dawn finally broke, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray that perfectly matched how I felt inside. My joints ached terribly from sleeping across the uneven, folded back seats of the vehicle. My stomach was entirely empty, but I felt absolutely no hunger. I only felt a terrifying, urgent desperation clawing at my throat. I sat up and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I looked like a man who had just lost a brutal, devastating war. My jaw was covered in thick stubble, my eyes were bloodshot and sunken, and my clothes were severely wrinkled. But I knew I could not afford to fall apart. Not yet. I needed a plan to fight back. I needed a ruthless lawyer to challenge the fabricated restraining order and expose the missing money. To get a lawyer, I needed cash immediately. Since my savings were completely wiped out and my joint credit cards were permanently frozen by Claire, my only option left in the world was my job. I was the supply chain manager at a major regional logistics hub. I had worked there for 9 highly productive years. I managed 50 dedicated employees, optimized complex shipping routes across 3 states, and saved the corporate office hundreds of thousands of dollars in operating costs every single quarter. I knew the human resources director very well. I planned to walk into her office, explain that I was going through a sudden vicious separation, and request an emergency payroll advance. It was a deeply humiliating thing to do, but pride was a luxury I could no longer afford to keep. I started the engine and drove toward the industrial park. The familiar hum of the tires on the highway gave me a false sense of temporary stability. For 30 minutes, I convinced myself that my career was the one solid, unbreakable pillar left in my collapsing world. The logistics center was my undisputed turf. I knew every forklift operator by name. I knew every shipping schedule by heart, and I knew every inch of the massive concrete warehouse floor. I parked my Ford Explorer in my designated management spot near the front entrance. I grabbed my gym bag and walked toward the heavy glass double doors of the main corporate lobby. The morning shift was just beginning to arrive. The familiar, comforting smell of diesel exhaust and fresh coffee filled the crisp morning air. I pulled my corporate badge from my pocket and pressed it against the security scanner mounted on the brick exterior wall. I expected the familiar green light and the sharp click of the magnetic lock releasing. Instead, the scanner emitted a harsh, flat red flash and a low buzzing sound. Access denied. I frowned, assuming it was a simple mistake. I pulled the plastic badge away, wiped the surface on my flannel sleeve, and pressed it against the electronic reader a second time. Red light. Buzz. Denied. A cold, heavy knot formed at the base of my throat. I told myself it was just a routine system glitch. The security server went down at least twice a year. I knocked firmly on the thick glass door. The security guard sitting at the front desk looked up. It was a man named Bill, someone I bought coffee and donuts for every single Friday morning. Bill did not smile. He did not wave me inside. He looked down at his desk, picked up a telephone, and deliberately avoided making any eye contact with me. My stomach dropped completely. 2 minutes later, the glass doors opened. But it was not Bill coming to let me in. It was my direct supervisor, Greg. Greg was the regional director of operations. We had stood side by side in the trenches during grueling, stressful holiday shipping rushes. We had shared beers at company picnics and talked about our families. But right now, Greg looked like he was walking out to attend a funeral. He stepped outside into the cold morning air and let the glass doors click shut and lock behind him. He was holding a familiar brown cardboard box. Greg did not look me in the eye. He held the box awkwardly against his chest. I looked inside the box and saw my framed photograph of Leo, my favorite ceramic coffee mug, and my small desk calendar. The cold knot in my throat expanded rapidly, making it incredibly hard to breathe, let alone swallow. I asked Greg what was going on and why my badge was deactivated. Greg let out a heavy sigh and shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He told me he was incredibly sorry. He said the order came down directly from the corporate executive board at 6 in the morning. I was being terminated immediately effective before I even arrived on the property. I stared at him in complete paralyzing disbelief. I asked him how they could fire me without a single warning or cause. I reminded him that my performance reviews were flawless, that my department was consistently the most profitable in the entire state. Greg finally looked up, and the expression on his face was a mixture of deep pity and absolute terror. He lowered his voice to a cautious, trembling whisper. He told me that my job performance had absolutely nothing to do with it. He said Rick Caldwell called the company president at the crack of dawn. Rick Caldwell was the regional vice president of the largest commercial real estate development firm in the city. More importantly, Rick Caldwell's firm was our logistics company's biggest and most lucrative corporate client. They accounted for a $12 million annual shipping contract that essentially kept our entire facility operational and profitable. Greg swallowed hard. He told me that Rick explicitly threatened to pull the entire $12 million contract by noon unless I was permanently and immediately removed from the premises. Rick had told our company president that I was a massive liability to their ongoing operations. Rick claimed I was involved in a messy, dangerous domestic situation and that I possessed severe character issues that made me entirely unfit for management. Greg said the board of directors did not even hesitate for a single second. Faced with losing $12 million in guaranteed revenue, my 9 years of intense loyalty and hard work meant absolutely nothing to them. I was a fast, easy sacrifice to keep the corporate bottom line secure. I stood on the wet concrete, staring at the man who used to be my trusted friend. I wanted to yell. I wanted to grab Greg by his collar and tell him the truth. I wanted to tell him that Rick Caldwell was currently sleeping with my wife. I wanted to tell him that Rick and Claire had maliciously stolen my entire life savings and fabricated a domestic restraining order just to steal my only child. But I looked at Greg's terrified, apologetic eyes and realized it would not matter at all. The truth did not matter here. The corporate world did not operate on truth, morality, or justice. It operated purely on leverage, money, and power. Rick Caldwell possessed a $12 million weapon, and he had aimed it directly at my head to guarantee my absolute silence and my total financial ruin. Greg handed me the cardboard box. He muttered another quiet apology, turned around, and walked back inside the warm, brightly lit building. The magnetic locks clicked loudly into place, sealing him inside. I was left completely alone on the outside, standing in the freezing wind. I walked slowly back to my cold vehicle. I set the cardboard box on the passenger seat right next to my gym bag. I sat behind the steering wheel and gripped the leather so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. The sheer scale of what they had done to me crashed down like a physical, suffocating weight. I had lost every single foundation of my existence in less than 24 hours. My life savings of $90,000 had been entirely erased by the woman I trusted most. My wife of 7 years had cruelly discarded me for a wealthy, arrogant executive. I was legally banned from returning to the suburban house I had painstakingly maintained and paid for. I was legally barred from seeing, speaking to, or holding my own 5-year-old son. And now the successful career I had built with my own bare hands had been entirely stripped away by a single malicious phone call. I had absolutely no money to fight them in family court. I had no home to retreat to for shelter. I had no income to sustain me or pay for basic survival. I was completely cornered by a legal system that blindly believed a fabricated piece of paper over a father's flawless track record, and a corporate system that valued a massive financial contract over basic human decency. They had built a perfect, inescapable cage around me. They expected me to simply fade away into the streets, to break down under the pressure, and disappear from their pristine, wealthy lives forever. I sat in the silent car and let the harsh reality of my absolute ruin wash over me. I felt the cold seeping through my boots. I felt the exhaustion pulling at my eyelids. But as I stared at the framed photograph of Leo resting inside that cardboard box, the crushing weight of despair stopped pushing me down. It started pushing me forward. They thought they had destroyed a simple working man. They had no idea they had just created a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. The sheer shock of a total collapse leaves a man physically numb. When your entire reality is ripped away in a matter of hours, your brain stops processing grief and switches entirely to a primal state of survival. I did not have the luxury of crying. I did not have the luxury of sitting in my cold Ford Explorer and feeling sorry for myself. I had to find my son. The thought of 5-year-old Leo waking up in a strange place without me, perhaps asking where his father was and receiving a cold lie from Claire, felt like a knife twisting directly in my ribs. I turned the ignition and pulled out of the corporate logistics center parking lot. The sun was fully up now, casting harsh, blinding glare across the wet asphalt. I needed an ally. I needed someone on the inside who could tell me where my wife had taken my boy. My mind raced through the shrinking list of people I trusted, and it landed on the only logical option remaining. Mitchell. Mitchell was Claire's younger brother. For 7 years, I had treated him like my own blood. When he struggled to pass his real estate licensing exam, I sat at our kitchen table and helped him run flashcards until 2 in the morning. When his first car broke down, I spent an entire Sunday underneath the chassis replacing the transmission fluid so he could make it to his property showings. We spent Thanksgivings carving turkeys together and summers grilling in my backyard. I honestly believed that despite his flaws and his constant obsession with money, Mitchell was family. I believed he would at least have the basic human decency to tell me if my son was safe. I drove out of the industrial zone and headed toward the wealthy gated subdivisions of the western suburbs. Mitchell lived in Oakwood Estates, a pristine manicured neighborhood defined by sprawling green lawns, oversized brick facades, and luxury vehicles sitting quietly in wide driveways. It was the kind of neighborhood where the homeowners association fined you if your grass grew a fraction of an inch too high. My mud-splattered Ford Explorer sounded like a dying tractor as I navigated the winding tree-lined streets. I pulled up to Mitchell's house and parked against the curb. The contrast was absolutely humiliating. His 2-story home looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine, complete with a perfectly white picket fence and a custom oak front door. I stepped out of my vehicle, my boots leaving dull marks on his immaculate concrete walkway. My work flannel was wrinkled and I smelled like damp wool and exhaust fumes. I walked up the stone steps and pressed the glowing doorbell camera. I heard the soft chime echo inside the massive house. I stood there for a long time, the cold wind biting at my face, rehearsing exactly how I would plead with him. I was fully prepared to swallow every single ounce of my pride. I just wanted to know that Leo had his asthma medication and that he was sleeping in a warm bed. The heavy oak door swung open. Mitchell stood in the doorway holding a steaming mug of expensive artisanal coffee. He was dressed in a pristine gray cashmere sweater and dark tailored slacks, looking completely relaxed on a Friday morning. He did not look surprised to see me standing on his porch. He did not look concerned by my haggard, exhausted appearance. He took a slow sip from his mug and leaned casually against the doorframe, blocking any view into the warmth of the house. I spoke first, my voice raspy and desperate. I asked him where Claire was. I asked him if Leo was safe. I practically begged him to just give me a street address or a phone number so I could hear my son's voice. I told him about the empty bank accounts, the sudden termination at work, and the fabricated restraining order. I threw all my cards on the table, expecting my brother-in-law to express shock or outrage. I expected him to grab his coat and help me figure out what kind of massive misunderstanding had just destroyed my life. Mitchell looked at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. He let out a short, sharp breath of amusement. The chuckle grew into a genuine, relaxed laugh. It was the kind of laugh a man lets out when he is watching a mildly entertaining television show. My heart stalled. The desperation in my chest suddenly collided with a horrific rising wave of realization. I asked him what was so funny. I asked him if he heard a single word I just said about his nephew. Mitchell stopped laughing, but the cruel smirk remained plastered across his face. He took another sip of his coffee and looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my cheap boots and wrinkled work jacket. He told me I was exactly as clueless as Claire always said I was. He said I was a blind man wandering through a world of people who actually knew how the game was played. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. He told me there was no misunderstanding. He told me the entire Sterling family knew exactly where Claire was, exactly where Leo was, and exactly what had happened to my $90,000. My breath hitched. I asked him what he was talking about. Mitchell smiled, a dark, gleaming look of superiority in his eyes. He confessed that Claire had brought Rick Caldwell to their parents' house for a private Sunday dinner 6 months ago. Half a year. For 6 entire months while I was working exhausting overtime shifts at the logistics center to build a college fund for my son, my wife was parading her wealthy corporate boss around her family. Mitchell casually mentioned how Rick had brought expensive vintage wine, how he had charmed their mother, and how he had sat in the living room discussing high-level investment portfolios with their father. The entire family had welcomed him with open arms. They had eaten the meals, drank the wine, and celebrated the affair behind my back. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me. My mind flashed back to the recent Thanksgiving dinner. I had sat at the head of the Sterling family table, carving the meat, pouring the drinks, and making sure everyone was comfortable. I remembered Mitchell looking at his phone and exchanging knowing glances with Claire. I remembered my mother-in-law asking me intrusive questions about my salary and hinting that Claire deserved a more luxurious lifestyle. I thought they were just being difficult. I never imagined they were actively comparing me to the millionaire executive sleeping with my wife. I stepped closer to the door, my voice shaking with a mixture of raw grief and boiling anger. I asked Mitchell how he could look me in the eye. I reminded him of the nights I spent helping him pass his real estate exams. I reminded him that I had treated him like a brother. I asked him how the entire family could sit around a dinner table and smile at me while plotting to steal my son and my life savings. Mitchell did not flinch. He did not possess a single shred of guilt. He looked at me with absolute undisguised contempt. He stated that the world revolves around providers, and I was simply not a real provider. He used those exact words. He called me a glorified warehouse box pusher. He told me that Claire was an ambitious, brilliant woman who was destined for executive boardrooms, and she was dragging an anchor by staying married to a blue-collar worker who wore safety vests for a living. He told me Rick Caldwell was a real man. Rick had a massive portfolio. Rick had regional power. Rick could give Leo private school education, international vacations, and a trust fund. Mitchell said the family did not view the affair as a betrayal. They viewed it as a massive, necessary upgrade. The utter lack of morality was staggering. They had rationalized the destruction of my family simply because Rick had a heavier wallet. The Sterling family worshipped money status and corporate titles, and they viewed my honest, grueling hard work as a pathetic character flaw. I felt a dangerous, burning heat rising in my chest. I told Mitchell he was a coward. I told him that stealing a father from his son was an unforgivable sin regardless of how much money Rick Caldwell promised them. I demanded he tell me where Leo was right now. Mitchell rolled his eyes, clearly bored by my emotional display. He told me to lower my voice before I upset the neighbors. Then he delivered the final, most devastating blow of the entire morning. He shifted his weight, smiled a sharp, predatory smile, and told me I needed to stop worrying about where Leo was sleeping and start worrying about where I was going to sleep. I asked him what he meant by that. I reminded him that my name was still on the deed to my suburban home regardless of the fraudulent restraining order. Mitchell chuckled again. He reached into the pocket of his slacks and pulled out a shiny new set of keys. They were the spare keys to my house. The keys I had given to him 2 years ago for emergencies. He dangled them in the cold air, the metal jingling sharply. He informed me that Rick Caldwell was a very thorough man. Rick knew that keeping a vacant house during a messy divorce was a financial liability. So Rick had generously pulled some strings at his corporate real estate firm and officially hired Mitchell as the primary listing agent for my property. Mitchell proudly announced that he was driving over to my neighborhood that very afternoon to hammer a for sale sign into my front lawn. He said Claire had already signed the preliminary authorization paperwork. They were going to liquidate the house, bury me in fabricated legal fees, using Claire's high-priced attorneys, and ensure I walked away from the marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. He told me the commission he was going to make on the sale of my stolen home would easily pay for his next luxury vacation. The sheer calculated evil of the plan left me entirely speechless. Rick and Claire had not just taken my money and my son, they had weaponized my own brother-in-law against me. They had turned my destruction into a lucrative financial opportunity for the Sterling family. They were dividing the spoils of my ruined life while I stood homeless on a freezing concrete porch. I took a step forward, my hands curling into tight, heavy fists. I did not want to hit him. I just wanted to shake him until he remembered what human decency looked like. I wanted to force him to see the agonizing pain radiating through every single nerve in my body. Mitchell saw the shift in my posture. He immediately took a step backward into the safety of his luxurious foyer. The smug arrogance on his face was instantly replaced by a cold, calculated threat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He held it up his thumb, hovering directly over the emergency dial button. He told me I had exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk off his manicured property. He reminded me that there was an active court-ordered restraining order against me. He said it explicitly painted me as a violent, erratic, financially abusive threat. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and told me that if I took one more step toward his door, he would dial the local police. He promised me he would tell the dispatcher that I was trespassing, making terroristic threats, and acting dangerously unstable. He smiled and reminded me that the police would not hesitate to throw a homeless, terminated, restrained man into a concrete holding cell. He was absolutely right. The legal system was completely rigged against me at that exact moment. They had the paperwork, they had the money, and they had the perfectly constructed narrative of a dangerous, disgruntled husband. If the police arrived at that house, I would lose the tiny sliver of freedom I had left. I would be locked away, and Claire would use the arrest to permanently sever any legal chance I ever had of seeing Leo again. I stood there, the freezing wind slicing through my jacket. I looked at the man I had treated like a brother. I looked at the beautiful home, the hot coffee, the designer clothes, and the absolute moral bankruptcy hiding behind it all. I realized in that moment that I was completely, fundamentally isolated from the world I thought I knew. The family I had married into was nothing more than a syndicate of greedy, shallow opportunists who would gladly step on my neck to get a slightly better view of the top. I slowly uncurled my fists. I let my hands drop to my sides. I did not yell. I did not curse at him. I simply looked at Mitchell with a calm, terrifying silence. I wanted him to remember the look on my face for the rest of his life. I turned around and walked down the stone steps. I walked across his perfect green lawn and climbed back into my freezing vehicle. I watched through the dirty windshield as Mitchell smirked one last time and slammed the heavy oak door shut, sealing himself inside his warm, comfortable illusion. The sharp click of his deadbolt echoed across the quiet suburban street. I put the vehicle in drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. I was now entirely cut off from my past. I had no wife, no son, no career, no savings, and absolutely no family support. I was a ghost driving through a society that had completely erased my existence. But as I navigated the winding roads out of that pristine neighborhood, the burning heat in my chest did not extinguish. It settled deep into my bones. Mitchell thought he had delivered the final fatal blow. He thought the Sterling family had won. But by stripping away every single thing I cared about, they had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. They had completely freed me from playing by their rules. The heavy oak doors of the family court building felt like the gates to a slaughterhouse. I walked through the metal detectors with a hollow pit in my stomach, wearing a cheap suit I had pulled from my gym bag and ironed on the floor of a motel room. The fabric was stiff and smelled faintly of cheap detergent. I had not slept in 3 days. My eyes burned under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway. I sat on a hard wooden bench waiting for my name to be called. I was entirely alone. I had no legal counsel. Every decent family law attorney I had called the previous afternoon demanded a $5,000 retainer just to walk into the building. Since my wife and her boss had drained my life savings, my bank account currently held exactly $14. I had no choice but to represent myself against a woman who now had access to a corporate empire. When the bailiff finally called our case, I walked into the courtroom and felt all the remaining air leave my lungs. Claire was already seated at the petitioner's table. She looked absolutely flawless. She wore a modest, conservative navy blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly, portraying the perfect image of a terrified, victimized mother. Sitting next to her was a man who looked like he had been engineered in a laboratory specifically to destroy lives. He was her attorney, a high-powered legal shark named Harrison Cole. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a platinum watch, and carried himself with an aura of absolute terrifying confidence. I knew instantly that Rick Caldwell was paying this man a fortune to utterly bury me. I took my seat at the respondent's table. I had a yellow legal pad and a single pen. Harrison Cole had 3 massive leather-bound binders stacked neatly in front of him. The judge entered the room. She was a stern woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and asked if the parties were ready to proceed with the preliminary hearing for custody and financial support. I stood up and nervously stated that I was representing myself. The judge gave me a cold, scrutinizing look. She warned me that the court would not grant me any special privileges just because I lacked counsel and that I was expected to follow all legal procedures perfectly. I swallowed hard and nodded. I thought the truth was simple enough to defend itself. I thought I could just tell the judge that Claire was having an affair with her millionaire boss, that they had conspired to lock me out of my home, and that my $90,000 had been stolen. I was incredibly dangerously naive. Harrison Cole stood up and completely hijacked the narrative before I could even formulate my opening sentence. He did not sound angry. He sounded deeply concerned, which made his lies infinitely more damaging. He told the judge that his client was a hard-working, devoted mother who was fleeing a highly volatile and financially toxic domestic situation. He painted a picture of me that was so foreign, so deeply twisted, that I actually looked around the room for a second to see if he was talking about another man. He claimed I had a severe, untreated psychological disorder that manifested in extreme financial recklessness. He told the court that Claire had been living in constant fear, hiding her own income just to ensure their 5-year-old son had food on the table. I jumped out of my chair. I yelled that he was lying. I pointed at Claire and shouted that she had stolen my money and that she was sleeping with her regional vice president. The judge slammed her gavel down so hard the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. She ordered me to sit down immediately and threatened to hold me in contempt of court if I ever interrupted opposing counsel again. My face burned with humiliation. I sank back into my wooden chair, gripping my pen so tightly it nearly snapped. Claire did not even look at me. She kept her eyes focused on her lap, playing the role of the intimidated wife to absolute perfection. Then Harrison Cole delivered the kill shot. He addressed the missing $90,000. He told the judge that Claire did not steal the money. He claimed that I had drained the joint account myself in a desperate, spiraling gambling addiction. He said he had the forensic financial proof to completely back up his claims. He opened his first heavy binder and handed a thick stack of glossy printed documents to the bailiff, who handed them up to the judge. Cole handed a duplicate copy to me. I stared at the papers, my mind going completely blank. The documents were bank statements, wire transfer logs, and internet protocol tracking sheets. They showed the entire $90,000 moving from our joint savings account into an offshore cryptocurrency exchange. But that was not the worst part. The accounts on the gambling platforms were registered perfectly under my name. They used my personal email address. They used my social security number. The login times were meticulously matched to the exact hours I had been sitting in my office at the logistics center. The forgery was an absolute masterpiece of corporate destruction. Rick Caldwell commanded a massive real estate development firm with an entire department of elite tech specialists. They had completely stolen my digital identity. They had created a flawless, untraceable paper trail that made it look like I had blown my family safety net on illegal high-stakes offshore betting. They even manufactured fake email receipts, thanking me for my deposits routed through proxy servers to make them look authentic. I frantically flipped through the pages, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I told the judge these documents were fake. I pleaded with her to look at the digital signatures. I told her I did not even know how to buy cryptocurrency, let alone gamble it on foreign websites. I begged her to subpoena Rick Caldwell and audit his corporate accounts. Harrison Cole just shook his head sadly. He told the judge that denial was the most common symptom of a severe gambling addict. He pointed out that my employment had been officially terminated just yesterday because of my erratic behavior. He submitted a sworn affidavit from my former boss, Greg. My stomach plummeted into a bottomless void. Greg had signed a legal document stating I was fired for character issues and instability, completely omitting the fact that Rick Caldwell had blackmailed the company into terminating me. The corporate machine had closed ranks perfectly. They had created a narrative so tight and so heavily documented that no family court judge in the country would ever doubt it. The judge looked down at the stack of papers, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. She looked at me not as a grieving father, but as a degenerate criminal who had destroyed his own family. I tried to speak again, but my throat was entirely dry. I had absolutely zero evidence to counter their lies. I had no lawyer to file objections. I had no financial records because Claire had locked me out of the digital banking portals. I was fighting a war against a nuclear superpower using nothing but a yellow legal pad. Harrison Cole moved in for the final slaughter. He requested that the court grant Claire full exclusive legal and physical custody of Leo immediately. He argued that a man who would gamble away his child's future college fund was a direct threat to the emotional and physical safety of that minor. He requested that my visitation rights be stripped down to strictly supervised weekend visits held in a state-monitored facility at my own personal expense. Furthermore, he requested that I be ordered to pay maximum child support to maintain the standard of living Leo was accustomed to. I stood up, my legs trembling. I told the judge I had no income. I told her I was sleeping in my vehicle because my wife had thrown me out with a fake restraining order. I told her I could not possibly pay maximum child support if I did not even have a job to go to. Harrison Cole smoothly interjected. He reminded the judge that child support is calculated on earning potential, not current employment status. He argued that I was a highly skilled logistics manager who had voluntarily lost his job due to gross misconduct. He requested the support be calculated based on my previous $85,000 salary. The trap was so perfectly constructed it took my breath away. They knew I was broke. They knew I was homeless. By setting the child support at a rate based on a salary I no longer possessed, they were guaranteeing that I would instantly fall into massive financial arrears. In a matter of months, the state would suspend my driver's license for non-payment. A few months after that, they would issue a warrant for my arrest. Rick and Claire were not just taking my son today. They were setting up a legal mechanism to slowly legally bury me alive. The judge did not hesitate. She looked at the mountain of fabricated evidence, adjusted her microphone, and delivered the verdict that shattered my entire universe. She stated that the evidence of severe financial abuse was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. She officially granted Claire full legal and physical custody of Leo. She ordered that I could only see my son for 2 hours every other Saturday, completely supervised by a social worker. She signed the order calculating my child support at $2,000 a month, effective immediately. She also extended the emergency restraining order, making it a permanent mandate that legally barred me from my own neighborhood and my own property. She slammed the gavel down. The sharp, hollow sound echoed off the wood-paneled walls, signaling the absolute end of my life as a father. I stood paralyzed at the respondents' table. The room started to spin. I looked over at Claire. For the first time since the hearing began, she finally lifted her head and looked directly at me. Her face was no longer the mask of a terrified, victimized mother. The corners of her mouth curled upward into a slow, chilling smirk. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had won. She had taken my money, my home, my reputation, and my child. She had used the justice system as her own personal weapon paid for by the man she was sleeping with. Harrison Cole packed his pristine binders into his leather briefcase, looking bored, like he had simply finished a routine piece of paperwork. He whispered something to Claire, and she nodded, standing up to leave the courtroom. They walked right past me. Neither of them said a single word. They did not have to. The destruction they left in their wake spoke volumes. I slowly packed my single pen and my blank yellow notepad into my gym bag. A court clerk handed me a thick stack of official rulings outlining all the ways I was now legally required to surrender my life. I walked out of the courtroom, my boots feeling like they were made of solid lead. I navigated the busy courthouse hallways, passing families, lawyers, and police officers. Nobody knew that a man had just been entirely erased from society in the room right down the hall. I pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. I walked back to my Ford Explorer, climbed inside, and stared blankly through the windshield. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening. I looked at the legal documents resting on my passenger seat. According to the state, I was a monster. According to my employer, I was a liability. According to my wife, I was a pathetic obstacle that needed to be removed. I picked up the court order denying me access to my son. I thought about Leo sitting in a classroom completely unaware that his father was legally forbidden from ever coming to pick him up again. I thought about Rick Caldwell moving his expensive clothes into my closet, parking his luxury car in my driveway, and playing the role of provider to a child I had loved since the moment he was born. The pain was so intense I thought my chest would physically crack open, but beneath the crushing agony deep in the absolute bottom of my ruined soul, something began to shift. The despair reached its maximum limit and then slowly transformed into a cold, terrifying clarity. They had used the system to break me. They had used money, corporate leverage, and fabricated paper trails to build a fortress around their lies. They assumed I was completely powerless because I did not wear a tailored suit or sit in an executive boardroom. They assumed a working man had no capacity to fight a war fought with legal contracts and corporate blackmail. But logistics is all about finding the weakest point in a chain. It is about understanding how a massive system moves where it is vulnerable and exactly how to dismantle it piece by piece. Rick and Claire thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They were wrong. By taking everything I cared about, they had completely removed every single boundary, rule, and limitation I had ever lived by. I started the engine of my vehicle. I did not know how I was going to do it yet, but I made a silent, unbreakable promise to the empty car. I was going to find their foundation and I was going to burn their entire empire straight to the ground. The neon sign outside my cheap motel room buzzed with a relentless, maddening hum. It cast a sickly red glow through the thin, torn curtains, illuminating a space that felt more like a prison cell than a sanctuary. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress staring at the peeling floral wallpaper, entirely consumed by the silence. 2 weeks had passed since the family court judge slammed her gavel and erased my existence. I had strictly followed every mandate of my supervised visitation, spending 2 agonizing hours every other Saturday sitting in a sterile government building watching my 5-year-old son Leo play with cheap plastic blocks, while a social worker took notes in the corner. Leo did not understand why we could not go to the park or why we could not go back to our house. I had to swallow my tears and tell him I was just working on a special project. Every time I had to hand him back to Claire at the end of those 2 hours, I felt another piece of my soul permanently die. I was running completely out of time and resources. The logistics industry is a small, tightly knit community. Rick Caldwell had made sure my termination was flagged as a severe behavioral issue, effectively blacklisting me from every major supply chain management firm in the tri-state area. My remaining cash was dwindling down to pennies. I was surviving on canned soup and instant coffee, desperately trying to figure out a way to hire a competent appellate lawyer. I needed thousands of dollars to even file a motion to review the fraudulent cryptocurrency documents Harrison Cole had submitted to the court. That morning, I made a routine trip to a battered local post office to check a small rental mailbox. I had opened the box 3 years ago to handle the residual estate mail of my late father. My dad, Thomas Hayes, was a quiet, meticulous man who spent 40 years working as a county tax assessor in a windowless municipal building. He was a man of rigid routines and immense integrity. He never made a fortune, but he understood the hidden mechanisms of the city better than the mayor himself. When he passed away from an aggressive lung condition, his estate was incredibly modest. He left me a small life insurance policy that paid for his funeral and the deed to a commercial storage unit on the decaying industrial side of town. During the chaotic nightmare of my sudden divorce and termination, the storage unit had completely slipped my mind. I opened the metal slot of the post office box and pulled out a single piece of thick cardstock paper. It was a bright pink urgent notice from the county revenue department. The bold black letters across the top read, "Final notice of foreclosure and public auction." I scanned the document, my heart sinking heavily against my ribs. The commercial storage unit my father left me had accumulated exactly $800 in unpaid property taxes over the past 3 years. The notice clearly stated that if the outstanding balance was not paid in full by certified funds within 48 hours, the unit and all of its contents would be permanently seized by the county and auctioned off to the highest bidder. A sudden surge of desperate hope flared up in my chest. My father was an incredibly organized man. He was not a hoarder. He never kept anything that lacked purpose or value. If he went through the trouble of leaving me the specific legal deed to a commercial storage space, there had to be something of significant financial worth inside it. My mind immediately raced through the possibilities. I thought he might have stored vintage family heirlooms, rare coin collections, or perhaps an old classic car he had secretly restored. Whatever was hiding behind that corrugated metal door could be the exact financial miracle I needed to hire a lawyer, expose Rick and Claire, and win back my son. But hope is a cruel emotion when your pockets are completely empty. I needed $800 by tomorrow afternoon to save the unit from the auction block. I walked back to my Ford Explorer and sat in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the cracked dashboard. I had no friends left to borrow from. Mitchell had made sure the entire family viewed me as a toxic gambling addict. I had no bank accounts. I only had one single item of true value left in this world. I reached under the driver's seat and pulled out my gym bag. I unzipped the side compartment and pulled out a small, faded velvet pouch. My fingers trembled as I loosened the drawstrings and tipped the pouch into my palm. A heavy, solid gold wedding band rolled into my hand. It was my late mother's ring. Before she passed away when I was in my 20s, she placed it in my hand and made me promise to keep it safe. She told me to pass it down to my own child one day so that a piece of her history would always protect the next generation. It was my most sacred possession. I had kept it hidden in a safe place, completely untouched, waiting for the day Leo was old enough to understand its meaning. Tears, hot and thick, welled up in my eyes. The thought of trading my mother's legacy to a stranger in a pawn shop made me physically sick to my stomach. It felt like an ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. But as I looked at the gold band, catching the dim light of the parking lot, I remembered the cold, triumphant smirk on Claire's face in the courtroom. I remembered the heavy, crushing weight of the security guards dragging me out of the corporate lobby. I realized that my mother would not want me to hold on to a piece of metal if it meant losing her only grandson to a corrupt, malicious system. I had to trade the past to fight for the future. I drove across town to a gritty, high-security pawn shop located behind a chain-link fence. The sky was pouring a steady, freezing rain, matching the absolute misery in my heart. I walked inside the bell above the door, ringing sharply. The air smelled of polished brass and old dust. I walked up to the thick, bulletproof glass counter and placed the velvet pouch into the metal sliding tray. A heavy-set pawnbroker with a magnifying loupe attached to his glasses pulled the tray through. He took the ring out, weighed it on a digital scale, and scrutinized the carat markings etched into the inner band. He looked at me with a completely emotionless expression and offered me exactly $850. I did not negotiate. I did not ask for a moment to think about it. I nodded my head once my throat entirely closed up. He slid a stack of worn $100 bills and a single $50 bill through the slot, along with a printed receipt. I picked up the money, turned around, and walked out into the rain. I felt like a hollow shell of a human being. I had just sold my family history for survival. I promised the universe that whatever was inside that storage unit was going to be worth the agonizing sacrifice I just made. I drove directly to the county courthouse annex. I stood in a long, depressing line of people paying traffic tickets and utility fines. When I reached the clerk's window, I handed over the $800 in cash and the bright pink foreclosure notice. The clerk stamped the paper with a heavy red seal that read, "Paid in full," and handed me a legal release form. The commercial storage unit was officially mine again. I did not waste a single second. I drove straight to the industrial park located near the abandoned train tracks on the far east side of the city. The area was completely desolate, populated only by stray dogs and rusted chain-link fences. Weeds pushed violently through the cracked, uneven asphalt. I navigated my vehicle down a long row of faded orange corrugated metal doors until I found unit number 42. I parked the truck and stepped out. The padlock securing the sliding latch was heavily rusted, completely fused shut from years of harsh weather exposure. I grabbed a heavy pair of steel bolt cutters from the trunk of my Ford Explorer. I positioned the iron jaws around the thick metal loop of the padlock, took a deep breath and squeezed the handles together with every ounce of physical strength I possessed in my arms. The rusty metal snapped with a sharp, violent crack. The heavy lock fell to the wet asphalt. I grabbed the metal handle of the storage door and pulled upward. The door groaned and shrieked in protest, the old rollers grinding against the metal tracks. A cloud of thick, suffocating dust billowed out into the damp air. I stepped back, coughing, and waited for the dust to settle. I pulled my flashlight from my jacket pocket, turned it on, and stepped over the threshold into the dark, cavernous space. My heart was pounding relentlessly. I swept the bright beam of light across the concrete floor, bracing myself to see a covered antique vehicle, a stack of valuable artwork, or a heavy floor safe filled with tangible assets. The beam of light hit the back wall. My stomach instantly plummeted into a bottomless, terrifying void. There was no car. There were no antiques. There was absolutely nothing of immediate financial value. The entire commercial unit was empty except for 4 massive, towering gray steel file cabinets pushed against the far cinder-block wall. Resting on top of a cheap, rusted folding table was a single metal lockbox. Stacked carelessly in the corner were dozens of thick cardboard tubes. I walked slowly toward the table, my mind refusing to accept the reality of the situation. The air inside the unit smelled heavily of mildew, decaying cardboard, and old, dry paper. I set my flashlight down on the table, picked up a heavy flathead screwdriver from my pocket, and wedged it under the latch of the rusted metal lockbox. I pried it open with a desperate, frantic twist of my wrist. The lid popped open. The lockbox was completely empty. There was not a single coin dollar bill or certificate inside. I turned my attention to the cardboard tubes. I pulled one open and slid out the contents. It was a massive, rolled-up architectural blueprint. I unrolled it across the dusty folding table. It was a county zoning map from 1995. It detailed commercial drainage systems and municipal utility lines for the Northern District. It was bureaucratic garbage. Panic began to rise in my chest, hot and suffocating. I walked over to the 4 towering steel file cabinets. I pulled the heavy top drawer of the first cabinet open. It was packed tightly with hundreds of manila folders. I pulled one out at random and opened it. It contained copies of local property tax assessment forms from 2 decades ago. I opened the second drawer. More tax codes, more property valuation surveys. I opened the third cabinet. More of the exact same useless, worthless municipal paperwork. My father had not left me a hidden fortune. He had left me his professional hoarding collection. He had spent his entire career obsessed with local property lines and municipal codes, and he had rented a commercial storage unit simply to house copies of the public records he stared at every single day of his life. The profound, catastrophic weight of my failure crashed down on my shoulders, physically buckling my knees. I had just pawned my dead mother's sacred gold wedding band to save a collection of outdated city maps and useless tax forms. I had traded the last piece of my dignity for absolute trash. I fell to my knees on the cold, dusty concrete floor. I dropped my face into my hands, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I broke. A loud, guttural sob tore itself from my throat. I felt an overwhelming, agonizing grief that transcended financial ruin. I saw Leo sitting in that sterile visitation room asking when he could come home. I saw Claire sipping champagne in her executive suite laughing at my total destruction. I saw Harrison Cole handing the judge those perfectly forged cryptocurrency documents, painting me as a degenerate failure. They were right. I was a failure. I was a man sitting in a dark, dusty storage unit crying over piles of yellowed paper while another man raised my son. I stayed on the floor for 10 excruciating minutes, letting the despair completely wash over me. But as the tears slowly stopped, the raw, blinding sadness began to compress into something entirely different. It condensed into a hard, volatile, explosive fury. I was furious at the corrupt legal system. I was furious at Rick Caldwell's immense corporate arrogance, but mostly I was furiously angry at my own helplessness. I stood up, my breathing heavy and ragged. I glared at the towering gray file cabinet in front of me, viewing it as the ultimate symbol of my complete defeat. A sudden, massive surge of adrenaline flooded my bloodstream. I clenched my jaw, took a half step back, and delivered a brutal maximum force kick directly into the reinforced steel base of the heaviest file cabinet. The violent metallic crash echoed like a bomb detonating inside the enclosed concrete unit. The impact dented the thick steel casing inward. The sheer force of my kick pushed the incredibly heavy, fully loaded cabinet backward about 3 inches. I stood there, panting, the physical pain in my foot momentarily drowning out the emotional agony in my chest. But as the ringing in my ears faded, I noticed something profoundly strange. When the massive steel file cabinet slid backward, it did not scrape smoothly against the concrete foundation. It caught the edge of something thick and wooden. I grabbed my flashlight from the folding table and aimed the bright beam down at the base of the cabinet. The floor directly underneath the massive steel unit was not made of poured concrete like the rest of the storage space. A large rectangular section of the floor had been expertly cut out and replaced with a thick, heavy oak plank. The file cabinet had been intentionally positioned to completely cover and conceal the wooden seam. When I kicked the cabinet backward, the heavy steel base had dragged against the wood, causing the thick plank to shift slightly out of alignment. I knelt down on the cold floor, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wedged my fingers into the narrow gap between the concrete and the shifted wooden board. The air escaping from the crack smelled deeply of dry earth and old leather. I braced my boots against the ground, gripped the edge of the heavy plank, and pulled upward with every remaining ounce of strength I had left. The board lifted with a deep, hollow thud, exposing a dark, rectangular cavity perfectly carved into the concrete foundation. Dust motes swirled like miniature planets in the tight beam of my flashlight as I dropped to my knees on the cold concrete. My fingertips scraped against the rough grain of the oak board I had just unearthed from its hiding spot under the steel cabinet. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, filling the freezing air of the storage unit with faint white plumes. I hooked my fingers beneath the heavy wooden plank and pried upward with a wet metallic grunt. The timber resisted for a second before giving way with a hollow pop that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. I threw the board aside. Down in the rectangular cavity, cut directly into the foundation, sat a heavily oiled waterproof canvas wrap. I reached in and lifted the bundle. It was surprisingly heavy, bound tightly with thick black utility bands that had preserved whatever was inside from decades of moisture and rot. My hands shook as I sliced through the bindings with the flathead screwdriver. I pulled back the stiff fabric, expecting to see stacks of old cash or perhaps a collection of bearer bonds. Instead, my light illuminated the smooth, cracked surface of a dark brown leather ledger, accompanied by a thick manila folder tied with faded red string. I climbed back onto my feet and laid the items onto the rusted folding table. The silence of the industrial park pressed heavily against my ears as I opened the cover of the bound book. The very first page bore my father's signature in his unmistakable, precise engineering script. Thomas Hayes, County Tax Assessor. Beneath his name was a short handwritten note dated exactly 2 years before his passing. It read, "Nolan, the world thinks a public servant is invisible because he sits in a basement office sorting paper. They do not realize that the man who logs the transactions sees the rot long before the building collapses. If you are reading this, the people who value greed over blood have pushed you to the edge. Stop crying. Look at the numbers and build your defense." A sudden shiver ran down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing draft leaking under the warehouse door. For my entire life, I had viewed my father as a passive, overly quiet bureaucrat who simply accepted his modest salary and went unnoticed by the wealthy elite of the city. I thought he had spent his life hiding from conflict. But as I flipped to the next page, I realized I had been completely blind. My father was not a passive observer. He was a silent, lethal watchdog who had spent 20 years cataloging the financial sins of the very monsters who had just destroyed my life. The ledger was a masterclass in forensic accounting. My father had used his unrestricted access to the county land registry and property tax databases to map out an intricate, sprawling web of local real estate shell companies. He had used different colored inks to cross-reference parcel numbers, corporate filings, and bank routing numbers. As I scanned the columns of numbers, a familiar corporate name began to appear over and over again. Caldwell Development Holdings. Beneath that umbrella were dozens of anonymous limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. Apex Land Partners, Summit Infrastructure Group, and Cedar River Development. I leaned closer to the pages, my eyes tracking the financial flows. My father had meticulously documented a 20-year history of massive tax evasion. Rick Caldwell's grandfather had started the scheme, but Rick had elevated it into a corporate art form. The records showed exactly how Rick's firm would purchase raw county land under a shell. Company artificially inflate the development costs through fake contractor receipts, and then claim massive property tax write-offs that effectively deprived the local municipality of millions of dollars in revenue. Every single transaction was backed up by a specific index number pointing to a hidden digital archive my father had maintained at the county building. Rick Caldwell thought he was a financial genius who was completely above the law. He had no idea that a quiet old man sitting in a windowless municipal office had spent 2 decades tying a legal noose around his entire corporate empire. The immediate sense of vindication was intoxicating, but a cold dose of reality quickly washed over me. This ledger was a devastating weapon against Rick Caldwell, but it did not solve my immediate desperate crisis. It did not invalidate the forged cryptocurrency gambling records that Harrison Cole had used to strip me of my child. If I walked into family court with a 30-year-old history of corporate tax fraud, the judge would simply tell me it was outside her jurisdiction and order me to pay the child support I could not afford. I needed a direct, immediate financial lever. I needed a mechanism to stop Claire and Rick from liquidating my house and moving my son out of the state. I closed the ledger and reached for the thick manila folder. I untied the red string and pulled out an original certified deed of trust bearing a gold county seal from the year 2001. It was not a deed for the storage unit. I spread the large faded grid map across the table, matching the legal description to the coordinates. The document proved that my father, acting through an anonymous blind trust named Blue Ridge Holdings, had purchased a 50-acre parcel of raw land located on the extreme northern border of the city line. I looked at the map completely confused at first. The property was a low-lying, toxic-looking plot of swampland wrapped around an old abandoned railway line. It was entirely unusable for residential housing or standard commercial retail. It had sat vacant for a quarter of a century, accumulating zero market value. I could not understand why my father would use his limited personal savings to buy 50 acres of useless mud through a highly complex blind trust. I pulled out the next document in the folder. It was a recent regional development blueprint stamped with a bright red label that read, "Confidential Executive Review Only." The date on the blueprint was exactly 3 months ago. My jaw went completely slack as I traced the highlighted borders on the map. The blueprint detailed the construction plans for the Caldwell North Logistics Gateway, a massive $200 million industrial distribution hub that Rick Caldwell's firm had been quietly organizing for the past 2 years. It was the crowning achievement of Rick's career, the exact project that had guaranteed his promotion to the National Executive Board. The document listed my ex-wife, Claire Hayes, as the lead operations director for the entire development. She had been given sole responsibility for clearing the local zoning permits and securing the utility access lines. I looked back at the original deed of trust, then back to the confidential corporate blueprint. A massive, brilliant realization exploded in my brain like a flash of lightning. The $200 million mega complex was completely landlocked. It was surrounded on 3 sides by protected state park reserves and an active interstate highway with no exit ramps. The only possible way for heavy freight trucks, construction equipment, and utility lines to enter or exit the massive distribution center was a narrow 2-lane access road that had to cut directly through the eastern border of the property. And that exact eastern border was the precise geographical coordinate of my father's 50-acre plot of swampland. My father had anticipated this 25 years ago. As the county tax assessor, he had studied the long-term municipal transit grids and realized that the city would eventually expand north. He knew that one day a major developer would try to buy up the northern valley, and he knew they would be completely trapped by the highway geography. He had quietly bought the access rights through an anonymous blind trust, paid the nominal holding fees for decades, and hid the deed in the foundation of a storage unit, waiting for the exact moment the corporate vultures tried to circle over his family. Rick Caldwell and Claire had spent millions of dollars buying up the surrounding land. They had already signed contracts with global shipping partners. They had already broken ground on the main facility. But they had completely failed to perform a comprehensive title search on the tiny historical blind trust that controlled the access road. They had assumed the land was abandoned county property that could be easily absorbed through a routine municipal easement. They had absolutely no idea that the entire legal entry point to their $200 million empire was entirely owned by the man they had left broke and homeless. I stood in the center of the dark storage unit, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face for the first time in weeks. The trap was absolutely flawless. Claire and her boss had spent months using high-priced lawyers, fabricated debts, and corporate blackmail to pin me to the wall. They thought they were playing a grand game of chess against a man who did not even have pieces on the board. They had no idea that my father had positioned a permanent checkmate underneath the floorboards 25 years before they even met. The raw power of the document in my hands made my fingers tingle. Claire was currently managing the project, risking her entire professional reputation on its successful launch. Mitchell was currently prepping my house for sale, salivating over a quick real estate commission. Rick Caldwell was currently sitting in his glass office believing he had successfully crushed a blue-collar worker who dared to stand in his way. They were all standing on a mountain of glass, completely unaware that I was holding the hammer that would shatter it into a million pieces. I carefully packed the brown ledger, the original deed of trust, and the confidential blueprints into my gym bag. I zipped it shut, the metallic slide sounding like a weapon being cocked in the silence of the room. I walked out of the storage unit, pulled the heavy corrugated door down, and snapped a brand new hardened steel padlock into the latch. The freezing rain had stopped, replaced by a sharp, crisp winter air that felt incredibly clean in my lungs. I climbed back into my Ford Explorer. I looked at the motel keycard sitting in my cup holder. I was still broke. I was still sleeping on a sagging mattress, and I was still required to see my son in a sterile government office under the eyes of a social worker. The legal problems were not gone, and the mountain I had to climb was still incredibly steep. But as I pulled out of the industrial park and drove back toward the city, the crushing sense of isolation disappeared completely. I was no longer a victim running from an engineered disaster. I was a manager executing a highly precise logistical counteroffensive. They had used their wealth to take my son, my house, and my career, believing that money was the ultimate authority in modern America. I was about to show them that a father's legacy built on absolute truth and ironclad legal proof is a force that no corporate suit can ever outrun. The sheer shock of a total collapse leaves a man physically numb. When your entire reality is ripped away in a matter of hours, your brain stops processing grief and switches entirely to a primal state of survival. I did not have the luxury of crying over the documents I found beneath the false floorboard of my father's storage unit. I did not have the luxury of sitting in my freezing vehicle to feel sorry for myself. I had to secure my son. The thought of 5-year-old Leo waking up in a strange place without me, surrounded by people who had maliciously orchestrated my ruin, felt like a knife twisting directly in my ribs. I had the original deed to a blind trust, a meticulously detailed forensic ledger of corporate tax fraud, and a highly confidential development blueprint. I possessed the ammunition, but I desperately needed a seasoned gunner to help me pull the trigger. I did not drive to Rick Caldwell's towering glass headquarters to wave the deed in his face. I did not call Claire to gloat about my discovery. The urge to scream my victory from the rooftops was incredibly strong, but a decade of supply chain management had taught me a fundamental truth about warfare. You never alert the enemy when you are secretly severing their supply lines. You simply cut the route and watch them slowly starve. I needed legal representation immediately. I was not looking for a polished corporate shark like Harrison Cole. I needed a trench fighter. I spent my morning in a dingy public library using their free computer to research local real estate attorneys who specialized in hostile land disputes. I was looking for a very specific breed of lawyer. I needed someone who despised massive corporate developers and had a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. I found a man named Walter Higgins. His office was located above a failing laundromat in a rundown commercial strip on the edge of the city. He was in his late 60s, possessed a notoriously foul temper, and had a heavily documented history of dragging major construction firms through years of agonizing municipal litigation. I walked into his cramped, poorly lit office. The space smelled strongly of stale black coffee and decaying paper. Walter sat behind a chaotic wooden desk, eyeing my wrinkled work flannel and unshaven face with deep, undisguised suspicion. I did not waste his time with a highly emotional sob story about my broken marriage. I simply unzipped my gym bag and placed the original deed of trust, my father's forensic tax ledger, and the stolen corporate blueprint directly onto his cluttered desk. I looked the old lawyer dead in the eye. I told Walter I had exactly $45 left to my name. But I also told him I possessed the exclusive legal chokehold on a $200 million industrial project currently owned by Rick Caldwell. Walter adjusted his thick reading glasses. He leaned forward and scrutinized the documents for a long, heavy 10 minutes. I stood in absolute silence, watching his expression slowly shift from mild annoyance to profound, absolute disbelief. He traced the property lines on the blueprint with his calloused index finger, comparing them against the coordinates listed on the original county deed. When he finally looked up at me, a dangerous, predatory smile stretched across his weathered face. He told me he would take my case on full contingency. He explicitly stated that ruining Rick Caldwell's quarterly projections and bleeding his corporate investors dry was worth infinitely more to him than any upfront retainer fee. Within 48 hours, Walter drafted one of the most aggressive ironclad injunctions in county history. He filed it quietly but forcefully with the State Land Management Division, the Municipal Zoning Board, and the local Environmental Protection Agency. The legal mandate explicitly prohibited any commercial trespassing, heavy machinery operation, or underground utility trenching on the 50-acre parcel legally owned by Blue Ridge Holdings. The trap was officially armed, and I did not have to do anything but step back and watch the carnage unfold. I did not have to be inside Rick Caldwell's executive suite to know exactly when the explosive device detonated. The shockwave echoed throughout the entire local commercial real estate sector. It happened on a damp Tuesday morning, just as the massive yellow excavators were preparing to break ground on the primary access road leading into the new logistics gateway. A county sheriff pulled up to the muddy construction site and handed the lead commercial foreman a court-ordered cease and desist mandate. The massive diesel engines were immediately shut down. The entire operation ground to an agonizing, incredibly expensive halt. I would later learn the exact, delightful details of the absolute chaos that instantly engulfed the corporate office. Claire had just walked into the main boardroom to present her finalized operational timeline to a group of powerful, impatient private equity investors. She was treating this crucial meeting as her official coronation. This massive project was her guaranteed ticket to a senior vice president promotion and a high six-figure executive bonus. Rick was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating his usual arrogant, untouchable confidence. Then his private cell phone rang. It was the frantic site manager informing him that the state had just locked down their only physical access point indefinitely. The color completely drained from Rick's face. The investors, immediately sensing the sudden panic in the room, demanded swift answers. A $200 million logistics hub is completely worthless if freight trucks cannot physically reach the loading docks. Every single day of construction delay cost the firm hundreds of thousands of dollars in bleeding interest, idle equipment rentals, and severe operational penalties. Claire tried to perform rapid damage control. She frantically pulled up the county zoning maps on the digital projector, insisting to the furious investors that the eastern border was just a neglected municipal easement. She swore it could be easily absorbed through a routine city council vote. But Rick's internal legal team rushed into the boardroom and quickly corrected her. The land was privately owned by a deeply embedded, highly shielded blind trust called Blue Ridge Holdings. The trust had paid its property taxes flawlessly for a quarter of a century. There was absolutely no legal loophole to exploit through eminent domain or forced municipal seizure. Rick demanded that his legal team find the owner of the trust immediately. He authorized a blank corporate check to buy the land out from under whoever was holding it. He assumed this was just a minor, albeit heavily expensive, bureaucratic hurdle. He figured the anonymous owner was simply a local speculator holding out for a lucrative multi-million-dollar payday. Rick had absolutely no idea that the owner of the trust was the exact same homeless, humiliated father he had banished to the freezing streets just weeks prior. The atmosphere inside the executive suite turned instantly toxic. The investors threatened to completely pull their funding and initiate a massive lawsuit if the access dispute was not permanently resolved within 30 days. Rick turned his explosive, unhinged rage directly onto Claire. He brutally blamed her for failing to perform a comprehensive title search on the surrounding property borders. The romantic, arrogant dynamic they shared quickly evaporated, replaced entirely by raw corporate panic and bitter, aggressive finger-pointing. Desperation makes arrogant men highly irrational. Rick needed an aggressive, unethical bulldog to track down the human being hiding behind Blue Ridge Holdings. He needed someone to knock on doors, bribe county clerks, and harass local officials until the anonymous owner was successfully unmasked. He delegated this crucial high-stakes task to the most eager, money-hungry subordinate he could find, my brother-in-law, Mitchell Sterling. Mitchell viewed this assignment as his ultimate opportunity to secure a permanent, high-paying seat at Rick's prestigious corporate table. He proudly put my suburban house listing on the back burner and threw himself entirely into the corporate hunt. He practically sprinted out of the office, boasting loudly to Claire that he would have the owner's name and a signed purchase agreement resting on Rick's desk by the end of the week. I spent my days sitting in my cold Ford Explorer across the street from the county records building, drinking instant coffee and watching Mitchell fail with absolute spectacular precision. My father had engineered that blind trust with terrifying meticulous efficiency. It was a fortress composed of impenetrable legal walls. Mitchell tried everything in his limited playbook. He aggressively interrogated the exhausted clerks at the tax assessor's office. He hired shady private investigators to trace the post office box registrations. He even tried to illegally bribe a low-level municipal judge to unseal the original corporate charter documents. Every single avenue led him directly into a solid brick wall of unyielding legal confidentiality. Walter Higgins had structured our defense perfectly. All communication regarding the property was routed strictly through Walter's dingy office above the laundromat. When Mitchell finally discovered through a frustrated clerk that Walter was the representing agent, he barged into the cramped space wearing his flashy designer suit, aggressively demanding an immediate meeting with the property owner. Walter did not even offer Mitchell a chair. He simply looked at the arrogant young residential realtor and told him that his client had absolutely no interest in selling the land to Caldwell Development Holdings. Mitchell lost his temper entirely. He slammed his fist heavily on Walter's cluttered desk, shouting that Rick Caldwell could crush this tiny, pathetic law firm and bury the anonymous owner in decades of crippling, expensive litigation. Walter just smiled his dangerous, predatory smile. He calmly informed Mitchell that any further unauthorized contact would result in a massive harassment and corporate espionage lawsuit against the entire real estate firm. He then politely instructed Mitchell to leave the premises before he called the local authorities to have him arrested for trespassing. Mitchell returned to Rick's executive suite entirely empty-handed. The week had passed. The massive construction site remained completely dead. The financial hemorrhage was becoming critical, threatening to bankrupt the entire regional branch of the firm. Rick was pacing the length of his massive office like a caged rabid animal when Mitchell walked in. Mitchell tried to make frantic excuses. He stammered nervously about complex legal shields, uncooperative lawyers, and bureaucratic red tape. He promised Rick he just needed a few more days to crack the shell companies open. Rick did not want to hear a single excuse. The immense crushing pressure from his furious investors had completely stripped away his polished, charming exterior. He looked at Mitchell with utter, devastating contempt. He told Mitchell he was completely useless. He called him a glorified amateur who was playing a sophisticated game far beyond his severely limited mental capacity. Right in front of Claire, Rick Caldwell verbally decimated her younger brother. He systematically and brutally tore apart Mitchell's professional pride. He officially revoked Mitchell's lucrative contract to sell my suburban home, stating he could no longer trust an incompetent fool with high-value firm assets. Then Rick pointed a shaking, furious finger at the heavy oak door and fired Mitchell on the spot, banning him from ever stepping foot inside the corporate building again. The sweet, profoundly satisfying irony of the situation was nearly intoxicating to witness. Mitchell had enthusiastically participated in the destruction of my family because he openly worshipped Rick Caldwell's power and wealth. He had cruelly mocked me while I stood homeless on his perfect concrete porch, threatening to call the police on a desperate father. Now that exact same power and wealth had chewed him up and violently spit him out into the street. Mitchell was suddenly jobless, entirely humiliated, and completely alienated from the corporate elite he so desperately tried to impress. The Sterling family alliance was severely cracking under the intense financial gravity of my silent blockade. Claire watched her brother get publicly destroyed by her lover, but she did not dare speak up to defend him. She was too terrified of losing her own precarious corporate position. She had abandoned her loyal husband and fractured her young family for a man who was now revealing his true monstrous nature, under the severe threat of losing his precious development deal. I received a phone call from Walter Higgins later that evening. I was sitting on the hood of my vehicle eating a cold sandwich under the flickering glow of a distant street lamp. Walter sounded incredibly amused. He told me that Rick Caldwell's primary legal counsel had just contacted him directly. It was Harrison Cole. The slick, high-powered shark who had maliciously fabricated the gambling documents to steal my son was now desperately begging Walter for an emergency negotiation meeting. Harrison Cole officially offered a massive multi-million-dollar cash settlement just to purchase the toxic swampland and lift the state injunction. Walter asked me what I wanted to do. He told me I could take the millions right now, sign the property over, and walk away a very wealthy man. I looked up at the dark, starless sky. I thought about the fake restraining order that kept me away from my own home. I thought about the empty bank accounts and the betrayal that nearly broke my mind. I thought about Leo sitting in a supervised visitation room, confused and deeply missing his father. I told Walter to reject the financial offer entirely. I did not want their corporate money. I wanted them to feel the exact same, absolute suffocating desperation they had forced upon me. I told Walter to string them along. I wanted them to sweat to bleed cash and to turn on each other like starved animals trapped in a cage. They had pushed a quiet, dedicated father into a corner, expecting him to curl up and vanish forever. They were slowly, painfully realizing they had awakened a relentless force that was going to meticulously, legally, and mercilessly dismantle every single thing they held dear. The intense pressure of a collapsing multi-million-dollar corporate development does not stay neatly confined inside a glass boardroom. It inevitably leaks through the walls, poisoning every single aspect of an executive's personal life. Rick Caldwell was discovering that bitter reality firsthand. His massive logistics gateway project was entirely paralyzed by my anonymous land trust, and his furious financial backers were officially demanding a comprehensive forensic audit of his entire regional division. That sudden corporate terror instantly bled directly into my family court proceedings. It happened on a cold Thursday morning. I was sitting in the cramped, poorly lit office of my attorney, Walter Higgins. The smell of stale coffee and old legal volumes hung heavily in the air. Walter was leaning back in his creaky leather chair, holding a thick stack of pristine, premium-grade legal paper. He tossed the document across the cluttered desk. It landed right in front of me with a heavy thud. Walter had a sharp, predatory gleam in his tired eyes. He told me that Harrison Cole, the high-priced shark attorney representing my wife, had frantically called him just an hour ago. Cole was aggressively demanding an immediate expedited divorce settlement. He wanted all marital assets completely finalized and permanently legally sealed by Friday afternoon. I stared at the thick document, completely confused by the sudden change in their legal strategy. Just a few weeks ago, Claire and Rick were perfectly content to drag me through months of agonizing court dates. They had planned to slowly drain my spirit and legally bury me alive using fabricated gambling debts and supervised visitation restrictions. I asked Walter why they were suddenly rushing to close the case. Walter laughed a dry, raspy laugh. He explained the beautiful, unforgiving mechanics of corporate panic. When private equity investors demand a forensic audit of a commercial real estate firm, the auditors do not just look at the business accounts. They look closely at the personal financial liabilities of the lead executives managing the project. Rick Caldwell and Claire were the primary directors of the paralyzed development. A messy, unresolved divorce involving $90,000 of contested life savings allegations of financial fraud and a bitter custody dispute was a massive, glowing red flag for any corporate auditor. Rick and Claire desperately needed a clean, legally sealed financial slate to survive the upcoming corporate scrutiny. They needed to quickly sweep my ruined life under the rug before the auditors started asking dangerous questions about where Claire suddenly got $90,000. I picked up the settlement offer and began reading the dense legal paragraphs. The absolute sheer audacity of their demands made my stomach churn with violent disgust. They were offering me a highly conditional surrender carefully disguised as an act of mercy. The document stated that Claire would graciously agree to drop all the fabricated allegations regarding my offshore cryptocurrency gambling. She would officially inform the family court judge that I was no longer a dangerous financial threat to our child. Furthermore, she would agree to lift the strict supervised visitation mandate. I would be allowed to see my 5-year-old son, Leo, every alternating weekend without a government social worker taking notes in the corner of the room. I stopped reading and looked up at Walter. I knew immediately that this sudden generosity came with a devastating price tag. I asked him what they wanted in exchange for giving me my son back. Walter pointed a calloused finger at the bottom half of the 3rd page. He told me to read the forfeiture clauses very carefully. In exchange for dropping their fake claims and allowing me basic parental visitation, I was required to sign a total, irrevocable forfeiture of every single marital asset we had accumulated over 7 years of marriage. I had to permanently sign over the deed to our suburban home, entirely relinquishing my legal right to any equity or future sale profits. I had to explicitly waive any legal claim to the stolen $90,000, legally reclassifying my stolen life savings as a voluntary marital gift to Claire. But the most insulting demand was hidden on the final page. They wanted me to sign a permanent, legally binding non-disclosure agreement. The contract strictly forbade me from ever speaking publicly or privately about Claire Rick Caldwell, their intimate relationship, or their financial activities. If I ever mentioned the stolen money or the fabricated court documents to anyone, they would legally sue me for millions of dollars in defamation damages. They were basically holding my own 5-year-old son hostage and demanding my absolute silence and my total financial surrender as the ransom payment. They wanted me to willingly lock myself inside the prison they had built for me, just so I could earn the privilege of seeing my boy twice a month. A dark, boiling rage flared up in my chest. My hands gripped the edges of the settlement paper so tightly that the crisp sheets began to tear. I wanted to drive straight to Rick Caldwell's corporate headquarters and throw the document directly through his office window. I wanted to scream at them for turning my love for my son into a cheap bargaining chip. Walter watched my face turn bright red. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. He told me to take a very deep breath and calm down immediately. He reminded me that anger is a useless emotion when you are setting a sophisticated legal trap. He told me that this insulting settlement offer was actually the greatest gift they could have possibly handed us. I looked at him desperately, trying to rein in my furious temper. I asked him how surrendering everything I owned could possibly be considered a gift. Walter smiled calmly. He explained that by legally demanding sole ownership of the marital assets and the external holding accounts, Claire was forcefully tying her own name to the exact financial channels Rick Caldwell had used to hide the stolen money. She was acting out of pure greed, completely unaware that we possessed my late father's forensic tax ledger. The ledger proved that Rick operated a vast network of illegal shell companies. If Claire legally absorbed those specific assets in a finalized divorce decree, she would simultaneously absorb full legal responsibility for 15 years of Rick's corporate tax fraud. Walter told me that we were going to use their own overwhelming arrogance against them. We were going to let them gorge on their greed. But to execute the final maneuver flawlessly, I had to play a very specific role. I had to walk into the final settlement meeting and act completely broken. I had to convince Rick and Claire that their vicious legal assault had successfully crushed my spirit. I had to look them in the eye and pretend I was a defeated, pathetic man who was willing to surrender everything just for a few hours with his son. Walter asked me if I possessed the discipline to swallow my pride and endure their insults one last time. I thought about the freezing nights I spent sleeping in the back of my Ford Explorer. I thought about the sheer humiliation of pawning my dead mother's gold wedding band just to survive another day. I thought about the hollow, empty look in Leo's eyes the last time I saw him in that sterile visitation room. Pride had absolutely no value to me anymore. I looked Walter directly in his eyes and told him I would play the role perfectly. I told him I was ready to walk right into the belly of the beast and set the hook. The meeting was scheduled for early Friday morning. It took place at the prestigious downtown law firm of Harrison Cole. The building was an imposing tower of reflective glass and dark steel designed specifically to intimidate anyone who walked through the front doors. I rode the silent, high-speed elevator to the 40th floor. The reception area was lined with imported Italian marble and featured massive panoramic windows overlooking the entire city skyline. I purposefully wore the same cheap, wrinkled suit I had worn to the preliminary hearing. I had intentionally skipped shaving for 2 days to make my face look haggard and exhausted. I kept my shoulders slumped forward and my eyes focused nervously on the polished floor. I channeled every single ounce of the genuine despair I had felt over the past 3 weeks and wore it like a heavy, suffocating cloak. A sharp-dressed paralegal escorted Walter and me into a massive glass-walled conference room. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with incredible tension and arrogant superiority. Harrison Cole sat at the head of a long, polished granite table. His thick leather binders were stacked neatly in front of him. Claire sat to his right. She wore a sharply tailored gray business suit, her posture rigid and defensive. But the detail that made my blood run entirely cold was the man sitting directly behind her. Rick Caldwell had actually shown up to my divorce settlement meeting. He was not a legal party to the proceedings, but he sat in a plush leather chair in the corner of the room, casually crossing his legs. He wore a custom navy suit and a smug, victorious smirk. He was there purely to assert his dominance. He wanted a front-row seat to watch the working-class husband officially surrender to his superior corporate power. I walked slowly to the opposite side of the granite table and took my seat. I kept my head down, refusing to make direct eye contact with Rick. I let my hands rest on the table intentionally, allowing my fingers to tremble just slightly. Harrison Cole cleared his throat, commanding the immediate attention of the room. He did not offer any polite greetings. He spoke with slick, condescending precision. He stated that his client was offering a highly generous compromise to avoid wasting any more valuable time in family court. He slid a crisp, finalized copy of the settlement agreement across the smooth granite surface toward me. Cole outlined the terms exactly as Walter had described them. He emphasized that Claire was willing to drop the severe allegations regarding my financial instability. He highlighted the fact that I would be granted regular unsupervised weekend access to Leo. He made it sound like an act of profound, unmatched charity. Then Cole shifted his tone to a sharp, commanding edge. He told me that in return for this generous access to my son, I would sign my name on the final page, totally forfeiting my right to the suburban house, completely waiving any claim to the $90,000, and binding myself to a strict lifetime gag order regarding Claire and her professional associates. I stared down at the documents. The silence in the conference room was heavy and suffocating. I could feel Rick Caldwell's arrogant eyes burning into the side of my face. Claire leaned forward slightly. Her voice was completely devoid of any warmth or history. She told me I needed to sign the papers immediately. She said I should be incredibly grateful that she was even allowing a deeply unstable man to be alone with her child. She told me to accept the reality of my situation, walk away quietly, and try to rebuild whatever was left of my pathetic life. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted a faint metallic drop of copper blood. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leap across the granite table and demand justice. I wanted to reveal the blind trust. I wanted to tell Claire that her $200 million corporate promotion was completely dead. But I forced myself to remember Walter's instructions. I had to let them set their own trap. I looked up at Claire, keeping my expression entirely defeated. I made my voice sound incredibly small and desperate. I asked her if she truly promised to let me pick up Leo this coming Friday. I asked her if I could finally take him to the park without a government supervisor watching my every move. Claire smiled a cold, clinical smile. She nodded her head slowly, looking at me with absolute pity. She promised me that the moment the judge stamped my signature on the forfeiture documents, I could see my son. Rick Caldwell let out a loud, mocking sigh from the corner of the room. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, speaking to me as if I were a slow, disobedient child. He told me to stop dragging out the inevitable. He said I had lost the game the moment I decided to fight people out of my league. He explicitly instructed me to take the miserable scraps they were generously throwing at me, sign my name on the dotted line, and disappear back into the gutter where I belonged. I lowered my head back down. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the final page. I let out a long, shaky breath, playing the role of a completely broken man conceding his final battle. I nodded my head slowly, staring at the paper. I spoke quietly, ensuring my voice sounded utterly resigned. I told them they had won. I said I would accept their terms, forfeit everything I owned, and sign the documents in front of the judge tomorrow morning. The atmosphere in the room instantly relaxed. Claire let out a massive sigh of relief, her rigid shoulders dropping. Harrison Cole smiled his slick shark-like smile and closed his expensive leather binder. Rick Caldwell actually chuckled a deep, satisfied sound of pure corporate triumph. They had successfully baited the hook, and they firmly believed I had swallowed it whole. They were completely blinded by their own immense arrogance. They were so incredibly desperate to secure their stolen wealth and protect their fragile corporate audit that they failed to see the danger sitting right across the table. They thought I was walking into the courtroom tomorrow to legally surrender my entire existence. They had absolutely no idea that I was actually walking into that courtroom to detonate a legal explosive that would permanently incinerate their entire world. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B felt entirely different this morning. They no longer resembled the gates of a slaughterhouse. Today they were the doors to an execution chamber, and I was holding the switch. I walked down the center aisle wearing the exact same cheap, ill-fitting suit I had worn during my initial defeat. I deliberately left my tie slightly crooked. I kept my shoulders hunched, my gaze lowered, and my footsteps heavy, perfectly embodying the broken, desperate father they fully expected to see. Claire was already seated at the petitioner's table. She looked radiant, practically glowing with the arrogant certainty of a woman who believed she had successfully conquered the world. She wore a pristine white tailored blazer, projecting an image of pure, untouchable corporate authority. Her high-priced shark of an attorney, Harrison Cole, sat beside her, effortlessly organizing his premium leather binders. He completely ignored my presence, treating me like an annoying administrative technicality that was about to be permanently swept away. But the most sickening display of sheer corporate hubris was sitting 3 rows back in the public viewing gallery. Rick Caldwell. He had actually cleared his executive schedule to watch my final surrender. He sat with his legs crossed, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal pinstripe suit that cost more than my first car. He leaned back against the wooden pew, resting his arm across the backrest, exuding the relaxed confidence of an apex predator watching its prey bleed out. When I took my seat at the solitary respondents' table, Rick caught my eye and offered a slow, patronizing smirk. He was savoring his absolute victory. He had stolen my savings, hijacked my home, taken my 5-year-old son, and blackmailed my employer into firing me. He firmly believed I was nothing more than a crushed insect beneath his polished leather shoes. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. The honorable magistrate took her seat at the elevated bench, peering down through her silver-rimmed glasses. She opened the massive file folder containing the expedited divorce and settlement agreement. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the crisp rustle of thick legal paper. She looked directly at me. Her expression was completely devoid of sympathy. To her, I was still the fabricated monster Harrison Cole had painted weeks ago, an erratic, financially abusive gambling addict who had recklessly destroyed his family. The judge cleared her throat and addressed me formally. She stated that before she provided her official signature to ratify this binding decree, she needed my verbal confirmation on the permanent forfeiture clauses. She read the brutal terms aloud, her voice echoing coldly off the acoustic paneling. She asked if I fully understood that by signing this document, I was irrevocably surrendering all rights, title, and interest in the marital home located in the western suburbs. She asked if I understood that I was permanently waiving any legal claim to the contested $90,000, officially reclassifying those missing funds as a voluntary, uncontested marital gift to my soon-to-be ex-wife. I kept my head bowed. I let out a ragged, shallow breath, playing my role to absolute perfection. I nodded slowly. The judge continued, her tone growing even sharper. She asked if I fully consented to the strict lifetime non-disclosure agreement. She explicitly warned me that if I ever spoke publicly or privately about the financial operations of my wife or her corporate associates, I would face immediate severe financial penalties and potential civil litigation. I glanced over at the petitioner's table. Claire was actively leaning forward, her eyes bright with greedy anticipation. She was practically vibrating with excitement. She wanted this clean, legally sealed financial slate to protect her upcoming promotion and shield Rick from the looming corporate audit. Harrison Cole had a sleek, expensive fountain pen already poised between his manicured fingers, ready to hand over my instrument of surrender. I turned my eyes back to the judge and quietly stated that I understood the terms perfectly. The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied that the troublesome, destitute father was finally submitting to the overwhelming power of the court. She instructed me to approach the bench, take the pen from opposing counsel, and initial the bottom of all 14 pages before providing my final signature on the execution line. I stood up from my wooden chair. My knees intentionally trembled just a fraction of an inch. I walked slowly across the polished floor toward the center podium. As I reached the table, Harrison Cole did not even bother to stand. He simply slid the heavy settlement document across the smooth wood, followed by his silver fountain pen. Claire looked up at me. The mask of the terrified mother completely vanished instantly, replaced by the ruthless, calculating corporate director I had discovered in that executive suite weeks ago. She leaned in close, ensuring the judge could not hear her. Her voice was a venomous, triumphant whisper. She sneered, "Just sign it, Nolan. You lost." I picked up the heavy silver pen. I held it in my hand for 3 agonizingly long seconds. I let the absolute silence of the courtroom stretch until the tension became physically uncomfortable. Then I stopped acting. I did not just straighten my posture. I completely transformed my entire physical presence. I dropped the hunched shoulders, raised my chin, and let the cold, hardened resolve I had forged in the freezing rain finally show on my face. The pathetic, broken warehouse worker vanished instantly, replaced by a man holding a weapon of mass corporate destruction. I placed Harrison Cole's expensive pen gently back onto the table. I reached inside my battered gym bag and pulled out a thick, securely bound stack of documents. The paper was premium-grade, stamped with the unmistakable heavy red seal of the Federal Circuit Court. I looked dead into Claire's eyes, watching the sudden sharp confusion flicker across her pupils. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute terrifying calm. Your Honor read page 2. I bypassed Harrison Cole entirely and handed my bound document directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. The magistrate frowned, visibly irritated by this sudden, unauthorized deviation from her schedule. She adjusted her glasses, pulled the document toward her, and began to read. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Walter Higgins, my gritty, relentless real estate attorney, strode down the center aisle. He was carrying a massive leather briefcase, looking like a man arriving to a feast. He walked right past Rick Caldwell in the gallery, ignoring the wealthy executive entirely, and took his rightful place, standing shoulder to shoulder with me at the podium. Harrison Cole immediately shot out of his chair, his polished composure cracking. He aggressively objected, demanding to know who this unrecognized attorney was and what unauthorized legal filing I had just introduced into a finalized settlement hearing. The judge held up her hand, completely ignoring Cole. Her eyes were darting rapidly back and forth across the crisp text of page 2. The profound irritation on her face was rapidly dissolving into absolute unadulterated shock. Page 2 was not a surrender. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a cross-filed emergency federal injunction completely backed by impenetrable property deeds and verified municipal tax codes. The judge looked up from the paper, staring at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. She looked over at Claire, then back to the document. Walter Higgins cleared his throat, his voice booming with absolute authority. He officially introduced himself as the primary legal counsel representing Blue Ridge Holdings. He casually informed the court that Blue Ridge Holdings was a deeply embedded historical blind trust that maintained total exclusive ownership of a highly contested 50-acre parcel of land on the northern city border. A sharp collective intake of breath echoed behind me. I did not have to turn around to know that Rick Caldwell had just stopped breathing. The $200 million mega distribution center. The defining project of his entire corporate career. The massive logistical hub that was currently paralyzed, bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars a day and driving his private equity investors into a murderous frenzy. Walter smiled his dangerous, predatory smile. He looked directly at Claire, who had suddenly turned the color of wet chalk. Walter announced to the court that the sole undisputed permanent owner of Blue Ridge Holdings was sitting right beside him. It was me, the man they had thrown into the street, the man they had stripped of his child and his dignity. I was the anonymous landowner who held the absolute legal chokehold on their corporate empire. I owned the only physical access point to their $200 million development, and I was never ever going to sell it to them. Harrison Cole began to stammer, flipping frantically through his own useless binders, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the trap they had just walked into. Claire was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were turning stark white. Her promotion, her executive bonus, and her entire professional reputation had just been instantly violently vaporized by the husband she deemed too low class to respect. But the execution was not over. The blind trust was only the first swing of the axe. The second swing was designed to sever their heads completely. I looked back up at the judge. She was reading the subsequent pages of the federal injunction, her eyes widening with every paragraph. Walter continued his relentless assault. He instructed the court to review the forensic accounting summaries attached to page 4. These summaries were meticulously extracted directly from my late father's 20-year tax ledger. They definitively proved that Rick Caldwell had been operating a massive illegal network of corporate shell companies to systematically evade millions of dollars in municipal property taxes. Apex Land Partners Summit Infrastructure Group and Cedar River Development. The judge read the exact routing numbers, the inflated contractor receipts, and the specific offshore accounts. The paper trail was absolutely flawless, backed by original certified county registry documents that my father had quietly collected for 2 decades. Harrison Cole shouted over Walter, his voice cracking with pure panic. Cole argued that this family courtroom had absolutely no jurisdiction over unverified corporate tax allegations involving a third-party executive. He desperately demanded the document be immediately stricken from the record. Walter let out a harsh, booming laugh. He turned to Cole, his eyes gleaming with merciless triumph. Walter explained that the family court had absolute jurisdiction because Claire and Harrison Cole had just explicitly legally demanded it. I watched the exact moment the devastating reality crashed down onto Claire's mind. In her desperate, greedy rush to steal the $90,000 and cover up the wire fraud before the corporate audit, Claire had demanded that the final divorce decree explicitly award her sole exclusive ownership of the external holding, LLC, where she had parked the stolen money. She had insisted on claiming every single external marital asset to ensure I walked away with nothing. But my father's forensic ledger proved exactly where that holding, LLC, came from. It was not a random bank account. It was a primary subsidiary shell company directly connected to Rick Caldwell's 20-year tax evasion syndicate. By aggressively pushing this expedited settlement by forcing me into a corner and legally demanding sole ownership of the marital estate and the external holding accounts, Claire had just voluntarily legally absorbed the corporate mechanism used to defraud the federal government. She had just signed her own name to 15 years of Rick Caldwell's felony racketeering and tax evasion. The trap had snapped completely shut, breaking their bones. The systemic karma was absolutely absolute. The judge slowly lowered the document. The courtroom was so intensely quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. The judge looked at Claire, who was now visibly hyperventilating, her perfect corporate composure entirely shattered. The judge looked at Harrison Cole, who was staring blankly at the granite table, realizing his pristine legal career was about to be heavily investigated by the Federal Bar Association. And then I heard the sound of a heavy wooden bench scraping violently against the floorboards in the gallery behind me. I slowly turned around. Rick Caldwell, the wealthy, arrogant, untouchable regional vice president, was standing up. His custom-tailored $5,000 suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. His face was flushed crimson and his eyes were wide with a raw, primal terror. He realized that the document resting on the judge's desk was not just a ruined real estate deal. It was a direct, undeniable map leading federal investigators straight to his doorstep. He turned toward the heavy mahogany doors, desperate to flee the building, desperate to start shredding hard drives and burning corporate files. But he was far too late. Walter Higgins had not just filed the injunction with the family court. He had securely delivered copies of my father's meticulously documented ledger to the Criminal Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission 48 hours ago. The authorities were already moving. I turned back to the petitioner's table and looked dead into Claire's terrified, tear-filled eyes. She opened her mouth, stammering my name, desperately trying to formulate an apology, trying to rewind the clock to a time when she held all the power. I simply shook my head, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy sense of justice. They had relentlessly manipulated the law to completely destroy my life. Now the exact same law was going to bury them in a prison of their own making. The absolute silence in the courtroom was so profound that I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the wall clock hanging above the jury box. The judge slowly turned the pages of the forensic audit summary that Walter Higgins had just submitted. She was a veteran magistrate who had presided over thousands of bitter domestic disputes, but the sheer scale of the deception laid out before her was clearly unprecedented. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the thick stacks of certified bank records, digital proxy server logs, and federal wire transfer receipts. With every passing second, the carefully constructed illusion that Claire and Rick Caldwell had built began to violently disintegrate. Harrison Cole stood frozen at the petitioner's table. The high-priced, aggressive shark of a lawyer had entirely lost his pristine composure. He was sweating visibly, his perfectly manicured hands resting flat against the polished granite surface as if he needed it to keep himself upright. He knew exactly what happens to an attorney who knowingly submits fabricated evidence to a federal or state judge. He was calculating his own survival. The judge finally looked up. She removed her silver-rimmed glasses and placed them deliberately on the wooden bench. She fixed her gaze directly on Claire. Her voice did not carry a single ounce of judicial neutralism. It was laced with a cold, absolute fury. She stated that she was looking at a certified, irrefutable financial trace initiated by a federal banking investigator. She read the exact routing numbers aloud, letting them echo through the silent room. She announced that the $90,000 missing from my joint savings account was never transferred to an offshore cryptocurrency gambling syndicate. It had never been converted into digital tokens or lost on a foreign betting platform. Instead, the money had been systematically routed through 3 domestic proxy servers before landing securely in a private commercial holding account right here in the state. The judge picked up the final page of the audit. She looked Claire dead in the eye and read the name of the holding company out loud. It was an exclusive limited liability corporation registered under Claire's exact maiden name. The air in the room instantly crystallized. Claire turned the color of wet ash. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She had stolen our family life savings, parked it in a secret account she believed was entirely untraceable, and then paid a team of elite corporate technicians to frame the father of her child as a degenerate gambling addict. It was not just a bitter divorce tactic. It was a calculated, malicious act of felony federal wire fraud. Harrison Cole did not hesitate for a single second. Self-preservation is the only true instinct a corporate lawyer possesses. He immediately took a massive step away from Claire, physically distancing himself from his own client. He addressed the judge with a frantic, trembling voice. He swore on his professional license that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of the fraudulent nature of the cryptocurrency documents. He claimed that Claire and Rick Caldwell had personally provided him with the fabricated financial statements just hours before the initial custody hearing. He threw my wife completely under the heavy wheels of the justice system to save his own career from a permanent disbarment. Claire looked at her attorney in sheer terror. She realized she was entirely, completely exposed. But the execution was nowhere near finished. The $90,000 wire fraud was merely the spark that ignited the powder keg. The true devastating brilliance of my late father's meticulous ledger was about to detonate. Walter Higgins stepped forward, resting his hands confidently on the podium. He did not yell. He did not gloat. He simply explained the beautiful, unforgiving mechanics of systemic karma. Walter addressed the judge and pointed to the heavily expedited settlement agreement that Claire had so desperately demanded I sign just minutes ago. He reminded the court that in her aggressive pursuit to leave me absolutely destitute, Claire had insisted on a total irrevocable forfeiture of all external marital assets. She had specifically explicitly demanded sole legal ownership of all holding companies' subsidiary accounts and external commercial entities connected to our marital estate. She wanted to guarantee that if I ever discovered where she hid the $90,000, I would have no legal right to reclaim it. Walter paused, letting the heavy reality of that legal demand hang in the air. Then he delivered the fatal blow. He explained that my father's 20-year tax ledger proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the specific holding company registered under Claire's maiden name was not just a simple bank account used to hide stolen savings. Rick Caldwell had utilized that exact same shell company as a central financial artery for his massive commercial tax evasion syndicate. For the past 3 years, Rick had been funneling millions of dollars of artificially inflated contractor receipts and fraudulent municipal tax write-offs directly through Claire's holding corporation. By demanding sole exclusive legal ownership of that specific corporate entity in a finalized state-binding divorce decree, Claire had just completely outsmarted herself. She had let her own toxic greed blind her. She had just voluntarily, legally claimed sole responsibility for a massive multi-million-dollar federal racketeering and tax evasion operation. If she had simply taken her massive corporate salary and walked away from our marriage, she might have remained shielded behind Rick's corporate veil. But her malicious, overwhelming need to destroy me and steal my last remaining dollar had officially made her the sole legal proprietor of a major criminal enterprise. I watched the exact moment the catastrophic reality crushed her. Claire's knees visibly buckled. She grabbed the edge of the granite table, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. She looked around the room like a trapped animal, realizing that the legal contract she thought was her ultimate victory was actually a permanent, inescapable prison sentence. She had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of absolute lies, and the wind had just violently changed direction. A sudden sharp scuffling sound broke the heavy tension in the room. I turned my head toward the public viewing gallery. Rick Caldwell was no longer sitting back with a smug, victorious smirk. The wealthy, untouchable regional vice president had sprung to his feet. His face was flushed a deep, terrifying crimson. He looked at the certified ledger on the judge's desk and realized that his entire corporate kingdom had just been legally dismantled by the son of a quiet county tax assessor. The invisible man he had mocked, the blue-collar worker he had threatened to crush, had just handed his entire 20-year criminal history directly to the judicial system. Rick did not try to defend Claire. He did not try to argue the facts. The cowardly executive immediately turned his back on the woman he had manipulated and practically sprinted toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom. He was desperate to reach the parking garage, desperate to get to his office and begin systematically shredding hard drives, burning physical files, and draining offshore accounts before the authorities could freeze his assets. He shoved the heavy oak doors open with a violent push, but he did not make it a single step into the hallway. Standing directly on the other side of the threshold was a solid wall of dark tactical vests. Walter Higgins had not just filed our injunction with the family court. Months ago, the moment my father's ledger was completely decoded and legally verified, Walter had quietly transmitted the entire forensic dossier to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. They had been silently building a massive airtight federal indictment while Rick and Claire foolishly focused all their attention on ruining my life in a family court. 4 heavily armed federal marshals stepped forcefully into the courtroom, pushing Rick Caldwell violently backward. The sheer overwhelming reality of federal authority completely stripped away Rick's arrogant corporate armor. A tall, broad-shouldered marshal firmly grabbed Rick by his custom-tailored shoulders, spun him around roughly, and slammed him chest-first against the back wall of the gallery. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around the millionaire executive's wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Rick stammered wildly, demanding his personal attorneys, threatening to sue the entire federal government, and shouting that he was a highly respected regional vice president. The marshals completely ignored his pathetic corporate tantrums. They recited his Miranda rights in a flat, monotone voice, thoroughly patted him down for weapons, and physically dragged him out of the courtroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind him, permanently sealing his fate. The powerful, untouchable boss, who had casually ordered my destruction over a glass of champagne, was gone, reduced to nothing more than a common federal inmate facing decades behind bars. The spectacle of Rick's sudden, brutal arrest completely broke whatever fragile remaining sanity Claire possessed. She collapsed entirely. She fell back into her wooden chair and began sobbing hysterically. Her pristine white-tailored blazer was wrinkled, her perfect composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. She pointed a trembling finger at the closed courtroom doors, screaming at the top of her lungs that Rick had manipulated her. She wailed that he was a monster, that he had forced her to open the holding accounts, and that she was merely an innocent victim of his immense corporate pressure. She begged the judge to believe that she never meant for any of this to go this far. The judge did not show a single fraction of an ounce of mercy. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with a thunderous, deafening strike that instantly silenced Claire's hysterical screaming. The magistrate leaned forward over the elevated bench, her eyes burning with righteous, uncompromising judicial fury. She told Claire that she was an absolute disgrace. She systematically listed every single crime my wife had so proudly committed over the past month: perjury, filing a deliberately false police report, extreme financial fraud, malicious domestic manipulation. But the judge explicitly stated that the most unforgivable crime of all was utilizing the sacred family court system as an instrument of terror to separate a loving father from his innocent 5-year-old child. The judge picked up the massive, heavily expedited settlement agreement that Claire and Harrison Cole had confidently handed me just 20 minutes prior. With a swift, aggressive motion, she tore the thick document completely in half, dropping the useless pieces of paper into her wastebasket. She announced that she was verbally issuing an immediate emergency superseding order. The judge officially revoked every single one of Claire's parental rights. She cited severe criminal endangerment, massive financial instability, and an active pending federal fraud investigation. She declared that Claire was entirely unfit to maintain any level of physical or legal custody over a minor. Then the judge looked directly at me. The harsh, cold scrutiny in her eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound, deeply earned respect. She formally granted me immediate, full, and exclusive physical and legal custody of my son Leo. She officially ordered the complete and immediate dissolution of the fraudulent restraining order, restoring my absolute right to return to my suburban home. Finally, she ordered the immediate unfreezing and full restitution of the stolen $90,000, demanding that Harrison Cole's law firm personally guarantee the transfer of funds by the end of the business day or face immediate federal sanctions. I stood at the podium, my hands gripping the wooden edges so tightly my muscles ached. I did not cheer. I did not gloat or stare down at my broken wife. I simply closed my eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath as a massive, suffocating mountain of anxiety completely lifted off my chest. The agonizing nightmare was officially over. The brutal, freezing nights sleeping in the back of my old vehicle were done. The humiliating, heavily supervised visitation hours in sterile government rooms were permanently finished. I had walked into a slaughterhouse expecting to be executed by a corrupt, wealthy corporate machine. Instead, I had utilized absolute truth, extreme patience, and the brilliant, silent legacy of my late father to completely dismantle their entire empire from the inside out. They had tried to bury me in the dark, completely forgetting that some men are incredibly comfortable doing the heavy lifting where no one else can see them. 6 months is a remarkably short amount of time for a man to witness the complete reconstruction of his entire universe. Half a year ago, I was shivering uncontrollably under a cheap moving blanket in the back of an aging Ford Explorer, praying that my 5-year-old son would remember my face. Today, I am standing on the solid hardwood floor of a home nobody can ever take away from me. The federal justice system moves with agonizing slowness until it finds an airtight, unassailable target. Once Walter Higgins handed over my late father's forensic tax ledger to the federal authorities, the massive gears of systemic karma engaged with terrifying speed. Rick Caldwell did not get a neat corporate exit. He did not get a golden parachute, a quiet resignation, or a polite press release. He got a pre-dawn raid by heavily armed federal agents at his luxury downtown penthouse. The untouchable regional vice president who once commanded boardrooms with absolute terror is now a designated inmate at a medium-security federal correctional institution. He is currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence for felony racketeering, corporate wire fraud, and massive municipal tax evasion. The federal government was absolutely merciless in their prosecution. They systematically froze his commercial bank accounts and fully liquidated his vast personal investment portfolios to recover decades of stolen taxpayer revenue. His $5,000 custom-tailored suits were replaced by standard-issue canvas prison uniforms, but the greatest blow to Rick was the total collapse of his professional legacy. His prized $200 million logistics mega center project was entirely abandoned by his panicked private equity investors. The massive concrete foundations he poured are currently sitting idle, slowly cracking under the harsh weather, completely reclaimed by the exact same toxic swampland he arrogantly assumed he could steal. The severe collateral damage of Rick's spectacular downfall quickly consumed everyone who had attached their wagon to his corrupt star. Claire managed to avoid a federal prison sentence, but only by the absolute slimmest of legal margins. Facing overwhelming documentary evidence proving her involvement in the wire fraud, she was forced to turn state's evidence. She had to completely cooperate with the prosecution to map out Rick's entire financial network. In exchange for her desperate testimony, she received 5 years of strict probation and a mandate to perform 2,000 hours of physical community service. She is currently spending her weekends picking up highway litter in a bright orange safety vest. Her corporate real estate firm terminated her immediately, stripping away her unvested stock options, her executive bonuses, and her carefully crafted professional reputation. Every single wealthy friend she had cultivated instantly blocked her phone number. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy to avoid the crushing civil penalties. With absolutely zero income and a ruined credit score, she had nowhere to go except crawling back to her younger brother Mitchell. But Mitchell was fighting his own brutal battle for basic survival. The State Real Estate Commission launched a massive independent investigation into his licensing practices, the exact moment Walter proved Mitchell was actively trying to sell my forcefully vacated home. The commission discovered his deep complicity in Rick's fraudulent property listings and permanently revoked his real estate license. Mitchell lost his pristine white picket fence home to a bank foreclosure just 2 months after I lost my logistics job. He was forced to sell his luxury vehicle just to pay his rapidly mounting legal defense fees. Today, Claire and Mitchell are living together in the damp, unfinished basement of a cheap rental property owned by their parents. They spend their days violently arguing, blaming each other for their total financial and social ruin. The Sterling family worshipped money above basic human decency, and when the money vanished, their entire family structure collapsed into bitter, toxic ashes. I did not let their misery consume my focus. I had a beautiful future to secure for my son. Walter Higgins and I held the absolute legal chokehold on the 50-acre access point, and we knew exactly how to use it. When Rick Caldwell's firm officially abandoned the Mega Center project, a rival national logistics corporation immediately stepped in to purchase the distressed concrete foundations. This new corporation was highly renowned for ethical business practices, fair labor standards, and massive community investment. They desperately needed the access road to complete the distribution hub. I sat in Walter's cramped office above the failing laundromat and negotiated the financial deal of a lifetime with their chief executive officer. I did not sell the land. I retained total legal ownership of the 50 acres my father bought a quarter-century ago. Instead, I signed a 99-year commercial ground lease granting the rival firm permanent transit access rights in exchange for a massive upfront signing bonus and a substantial guaranteed monthly royalty payment. The financial reward was staggering, but more importantly, it was entirely clean. It was money built on absolute patience, immense leverage, and the brilliant foresight of a quiet tax assessor. I finally possessed the deep, unbreakable financial security I had worked double shifts in a warehouse for nearly a decade to achieve. But true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with commercial ground leases or monthly royalty checks. True wealth is what happened at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I parked my newly purchased reliable sedan in front of the local elementary school. The afternoon sun was warm, casting a brilliant golden light across the playground asphalt. When the kindergarten dismissal bell rang, the heavy metal doors pushed open and a flood of children poured out onto the sidewalk. I stood by the front gate, waiting patiently. Suddenly, I heard a sharp, joyful shout. Leo came running down the concrete pathway, his heavy blue backpack bouncing wildly against his small shoulders. He threw his arms around my waist, burying his face deeply into my jacket. I knelt down on the warm sidewalk, wrapping my arms securely around his small frame, breathing in the incredibly familiar scent of his shampoo. I asked him how his day was, and he launched into a highly detailed animated story about a colorful painting he made in art class. There were no stern social workers taking notes in the corner of a sterile room. There were no ticking clocks counting down my authorized visitation time. There was only a father and his son existing in perfect, unrestricted peace. We climbed into the car and drove through town. Leo sat in the back seat, pointing out different delivery trucks and dogs along the route, laughing brightly at his own wonderful jokes. We pulled into our new neighborhood. I did not buy a sprawling mansion in an exclusive gated community like the one Mitchell used to flaunt to his shallow friends. I bought a solid, modest single-story brick house in a quiet, family-oriented subdivision with excellent public schools. It has a wide front porch, an incredibly sturdy roof, and a massive fenced-in backyard bordered by old, beautiful oak trees. It is the exact house I was saving for when Claire and Rick decided to maliciously steal my $90,000. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door, and Leo immediately ran down the hallway to his bright bedroom to show me where he had organized his collection of toy cars. The house smelled incredibly comforting, filled with the scent of fresh paint and clean wood. The kitchen was wide open, filled with the quiet, steady hum of the new refrigerator. I walked to the granite counter and started preparing a warm dinner. I chopped fresh vegetables and seasoned chicken, listening to the incredibly sweet sound of my son playing safely in the other room. We ate together at a simple wooden dining table, talking about everything and nothing at all. I helped him with his basic math homework. I read him 2 long, adventurous bedtime stories, and I tucked him tightly under his thick winter blankets. I sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing grew slow and steady, watching him sleep in total, absolute safety. I gently closed his bedroom door and walked back out into the quiet, empty living room. The house was deeply, beautifully still. I walked over to the tall brick fireplace. Resting precisely in the center of the thick wooden mantel was the dark brown leather ledger my father had hidden beneath the floorboards of that rusted storage unit so many years ago. The edges of the book were heavily worn, and the binding leather was cracked from decades of secret handling. I reached out and let my fingertips rest lightly against the smooth, cool cover. For years, I had mistakenly believed my father was a passive, weak man who let the harsh world walk all over him. I thought he was a low-level bureaucrat who left me a pile of worthless municipal garbage. I had to lose every single thing I owned to finally understand the profound, breathtaking magnitude of his silent, brilliant strength. He saw the wealthy corruption rotting the core foundation of our city, and he quietly spent 20 years building an ironclad legal weapon to protect his family long after he was gone. He did not leave me volatile cash or empty luxury vehicles. He left me the undeniable, unstoppable power of truth. I picked up the heavy ledger and held it firmly against my chest. The agonizing, terrifying journey of the past 6 months flashed clearly through my mind. The freezing rain cutting through my thin work clothes, the desperate, humiliating trip to the pawn shop, the arrogant smirks in the corporate boardroom, the terrifying, crushing silence of the family court. I survived all of that devastating pain because I absolutely refused to let their lies become my reality. I refused to let their immense corporate power convince me that I was a worthless man. I stood my ground when the entire world told me to surrender, and because of that unwavering choice, I was standing in my own home, holding the legacy that saved my son. They thought power was defined by the zeros in a bank account and the destruction of a man's character. They didn't realize that a father's legacy built on integrity and patience is an armor no corporate suit can pierce. They took everything they thought mattered, only to hand me the weapon that dismantled them. If you believe that the truth never stays buried and systemic karma always comes for those who destroy families, hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more stories where the invisible man wins in the end.